Voila.
Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris, and joining us this evening in Cyprus, we have the one and only, the great Robert Barnes. Robert, how are you doing? Where can people find your work?
Absolutely. I'm always glad to be here. I always get sort of different feedback of the folks that follow that follow you guys routinely, both your individual channels and the Duran channel. And I always try to explain that the Duran is basically like if you had your own personal private intelligence agency that, trying to provide objective analysis about the entire world, try to provide predictive capacity as to what someone's likely to do or not do, whether something's likely to work or not work. If there's any bias, it's biased towards peace and biased towards prosperity. Otherwise, but of course, people always want you to take sides. It's got to be Russia or Ukraine. It's got to be Israel or Iran. It's got to be U.S. or China. That would interfere with the ability to provide as independent, objective analysis as you can in that context. And there's some better and bad faith actors along the way interpreting what's going to occur. For those unfamiliar, my perspective comes from a populist American perspective with ties in Trump world. I've either represented or am friends with President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary Kennedy, Director Tulsi Gabbard. But I come from that populist side of the aisle, involved in law and politics in the United States, and I like to bet on elections. We'll see about the Polish elections upcoming. These days, you always had to factor in the fraud factor, but it's taking on a whole new meaning in Europe, European elections and elsewhere, as you try to guesstimate where things are going to go. Try to put my money where my mouth is in trying to be predictive and analytical. It's always funny because I'll either get feedback that says, they hate Trump now. They're get that crowd that doesn't like one particular interpretation. My favorite stuff is when I'm on or some other people are on that are more part of Trump world. It's, we now know what the 2 A's in MAGA stand for. It stands for Alex and Alexander. That was my favorite critique. So can't wait for trying. But it's always a privilege and a pleasure to be here. If you want to follow all of the law and politics content about America, that's at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. I put up all the predictions for betting on elections. We'll have some up later today on the Polish elections. I think there may be some good odds there at sportspicks.locals.com. I do have some recommended additional merch for the excellent Duran shop. I'm thinking you do a combined package of Macron's magic handkerchief with Mertz's magic straw, and apparently will have the same effect on your brain as cocaine. From what we witnessed. So let's have some fun.
Just don't get slapped.
Yeah, exactly. I'm surprised if Trump was being real Trump, or if he was just feeling a little. He would throw himself in there somehow. Like he did with Bruce Springsteen hitting the golf ball, and Bruce Springsteen falls down. And have his face behind the scenes of smacking Macron. But it's not going to help the whole various theories out there about whether his wife really wears the pants in the family, maybe more ways than one, with that kind of slap right for the world to see.
And Robert, I am digging the Duran hat, baseball hat.
Yeah, I love it.
Looking good. All right, we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. So Alexander, Robert, let's just jump into it. Hello to everybody that's watching, and thank you to our moderators. Let's talk about some news.
A huge amount to talk about because, of course, there's a massive amount going on around the world, but there's also a massive amount going on in the United States. And I'm going to make a suggestion, which is that one of the things that people get wrong about Donald Trump is that they assume that his overriding priority is to go around the world either sorting out wars in various places or ending wars in other places or starting wars in places. My own view is completely different. I believe that Donald Trump's priorities lie within the United States itself. If you don't understand that about Trump, you've understood nothing. Other presidents are all about foreign policy. Joe Biden, I think, ultimately, to the extent that he was a president at all, I mean, I'm not talking about the man himself, maybe his administration, but it was primarily about foreign policy. Donald Trump is about the United States. He's connected to a massive electoral base in the United States, the strongest, most cohesive electoral base that any president has had for a very long time, arguably back to Ronald Reagan. And at the same time, he is most concerned about change within the United States. And of course, he's running up against all sorts of people within the United States who do not desire change. And amongst them is what you might call America's permanent government, only it's not actually permanent. It's not been around in historical time for very long. It really developed basically in the 1960s, but it has become very powerful. And it is what we call the deep state. And I think Donald Trump is fighting. It has to fight it all the time because they are fighting him. They won't let go and they won't stop. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the United States is partly about that. And they got their friends within the administration. They got their friends in Congress. They've got their friends in the Washington bureaucracy. They've got their friends in the judiciary as well. And the Democratic Party is, in my opinion, allied to them. It's allied to them so much that you could almost say that it's part of them. And within the Republican Party, it has its friends also. So am I right in this, Robert? I mean, that is my own perception. I think that most of the time, Donald Trump is worrying, thinking about what these people are trying to do. And inevitably, that affects the time he's able to give to other matters and his room for maneuver as well. And in some respects, given that, we're at now plus 100 days from his being inaugurated, and he dominates the political scene in the United States to an extent that no president that I can remember since Reagan has done. You have to say he's actually played his political cards with quite a lot of skill and maneuvered very deftly. But anyway, what are your thoughts about this, Robert?
Yeah, I think the great adversary of peace and prosperity around the world is the American deep state. Now, some people call it national security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the administrative state. You can use whatever nomenclature you want, but the idea of the deep state comes from the dual state, originated in Britain with a publisher at The Economist, late 19th century, trying to explain how you could have a government completely immune from elections. And that this whole administrative bureaucracy, colonial bureaucracy, had built up that was acting independent of the will of the voters in Britain. And in the U.S., when you apply that dual state intellectual construct to the national security apparatus, when you tie in law enforcement, you tie in parts of the judicial branch, tie in parts of institutional media, academia, the think tank world, as well as their representatives in the House and the Senate, then they're supposed to be representing their constituents, but often that's not who they're representing because of the capture of the donor class by deep state and the media by deep state aligned interest. That's the most destabilizing force in the world and has been now since the 1960s, at least. There are various efforts to create a deep state in the United States. First meaningful effort was during the Civil War. That there's some that believe the assassination attempt on President Lincoln was in fact a first ever deep state coup attempt, because they attempted also to take out the vice president, secretary of state, and General Grant on the same night, often forgot, unless you're watching a TV show like Timeless, for example, that gets into it. As just a fiction plot, narrative point. And then they tried to rebuild after World War I. There was a lot of political blowback here in the United States. Great senators like Gerald Nye, comes from the great Republican populist anti-war tradition. This is, Smedley Butler, War is a Racket. He did the war racketeering committees in the Senate, leading into World War II. But World War II helped consolidate their power. Right after that, they were able to institutionalize their power within the Pentagon, represented by some of generals like Curtis LeMay, bombs away LeMay, who was so proud of firebombing Dresden that he went and firebombed Tokyo. The people who said, "Hey, we're ahead on the nuclear weapons. Let's use them." They wanted to invade Russia, they wanted to invade China, they wanted to conquer the world. Eisenhower held them back. But even Eisenhower was so intimidated by their power that he didn't say anything about it until his farewell address on the way out. He warns about the military-industrial complex. And people forget he also warned about the administrative state. Said it's going to co-opt and corrupt academia, institutions, think tanks. all of his predictions, unfortunately, have came to fruition. President Kennedy discovered it in live time, and when he took any actions to try to curtail their excesses, they murdered him. When his brother ran for president 5 years later, they murdered him. And in the interim, they murdered Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, King being America's arguably greatest unelected political hero in our history. Then, of course, they impeach President Nixon. Some would say because he was trying to challenge deep state power in his own way, namely maybe for his own power. But that led to the only sort of rectification or remedy about truth and reconciliation, if you will, of American deep state power with the Church Committee. And that was because Senator Frank Church, coming from the populist tradition out of Idaho that you used to be strong there, and because he'd been spied on. He was the first senator spied on by the National Security Agency. That led to MK Ultra being exposed, the assassination coup attempts around the world being exposed, some remedy in the sense of some people fired, like Mark Felt, who was deep throat. Really, he was deep state, working with Bob Woodward, who's long been a deep state ally, contrary to conventional wisdom. Was presented as the contrary in all the president's men. But that didn't last very long. Even Nixon would argue for the pardon of Mark Felt to President Reagan, not knowing that Felt was the one who overthrew him in the first place. And it's like what Putin said in his interviews with Oliver Stone. He said, I think a lot of these American political leaders want to do good, actually want peace, but it doesn't matter. Once they get in, the men in gray suits run the world and run America's foreign policy. And you're absolutely right. Trump comes from an old American populist tradition that has been forgotten in parts of the American political and global political world, which is America was founded on anti-war, anti-imperial, anti-colonial ambitions. And the deep state is a direct opposition to all of that. Famously, President Adams said, we do not go abroad searching for monsters to destroy. America was founded in particular at staying the heck out of Europe. Stay out of European conflicts, stay out of European problems, stay out of European issues. Don't become involved in that. McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt would shift that to a degree, but it would stay continental. Our interest would be on the Americas, not outside of the Americas. World War I was a deviation from that. World War II was a deviation from that. But from World War II, they institutionalized their power within the bureaucracy. And they've only aggregated more and more and more of it. To where today, like Trump's biggest opposition on anything he does on foreign policy isn't from the American electorate. It isn't from the ordinary person. It is entirely from this deep state apparatus that has so much institutionalized power. And it's what he, like on Ukraine, with the needle he's trying to go through is with his MAGA base on the one hand that wants us out of these dumb wars, and the deep state on the other hand. And where does Trump experience that? Well, he experienced it in person. Not only does he realize and know that's what happened to the Kennedy brothers, is their opposition to deep state priorities got them killed, but he just says, let's get along with Putin. What happens? They launch a massive investigation and a massive spy campaign of him and his entire campaign, his entire family for 2 years. It started with Spygate under Comey and then continued with Mueller. Then he says, well, maybe we should just at least halt how much arms we send to Ukraine. Maybe we just halt this to figure out what all the corruption is connected to Biden and the rest. And they impeach him. I mean, all he did was delay it. He didn't stop it, didn't prevent it, didn't prohibit it, just delayed it, and they impeached him. Then he goes further. He discloses that he stayed out of war with Iran after he left office his first term, and they indict him. I mean, one of the grounds of the indictment was that he shared the fact that he blocked the Iranian war plan that Milley and others were trying to goad him into. And last but not, unfortunately not least, they tried to murder him not once but twice. And the first assassin has like MK Ultra Manchurian candidate tattooed on his forehead, 8 different phones, all kinds of missing evidence, things that just don't make any sense at all. Incredibly unexplained to this day, secret security lapses. Of course, if you listen to Dan Bongino, you wouldn't know that because he and Kash Patel are busy being dog walked by the deep state as we speak, to give you an idea about the deep state power so entrenched, so institutionalized. 2 very verbal, vocal opponents wussed out very quickly within 100 days of any meaningful challenge of using their law enforcement power to clean up what is a poisonous tree that was planted in the roots by J. Edgar Hoover himself. There was no way that agency was going to be anything but a deep state ally rather than a deep state adversary. And of course, the second assassin has Ukraine tattooed on his forehead, kept going to Ukraine, kept trying to get missiles to Ukraine, all the rest. And all of this, they're trying to cover up and hide and mask and doing. But Trump realizes it. Okay, if I challenge the American deep state, They're going to investigate me, impeach me, indict me, and try to murder me. So that's the real restraint. Like legally, there's no restraint on Trump just saying, I'm done with it. Or there's no political restraint in terms of the American will and the American opinion. And if he was serious about trying to get a peace deal with Ukraine, Trump knows leverage like nobody does, like no president previous. I mean, that's his wheelhouse. The weak party is who you put pressure on in a negotiation. The weak party is Ukraine. The weak party is Zelensky. They're getting whooped in the war, like we predicted would happen. It's an unpopular war, as we also predicted would happen. And the years ago at the time, to some questions and controversy and allegations were all Putin plants, and the rest. And so I think actually when Trump came in, by the way, I think he was actually on board with the same advice you guys were giving from the inception, which is just to get out of the conflict. Because if he wanted to actually negotiate a peace, you let the Department of Justice leak that they're doing an investigation on money laundering related to Ukraine that would implicate all the military-industrial complex folks, that would implicate Zelensky, implicate all of Zelensky's allies, because they've committed massive crimes on a massive scale. And you put that leverage on them, and then the other leverage you say is we're going to withdraw all support, all aid, all the rest, and you're probably going to prison for life, and your friends and allies, and your MIC friends and allies here in the United States are going to be under investigation and indictment and potential imprisonment, much like what Mark Felt and the other deep state allies were in the late 1970s after the revelations of the Church Committee. He didn't do any of that. And in my view, it's not because he's necessarily ideologically influenced by the neocons that he himself has brought into aspects of his administration, whether it's Mike Waltz or General Kellogg or others. I think it's because his recognition of deep state power in America is just very broad, very deep. And that they've tried to do everything possible to take him out the moment he just breaches a little bit of their paradigm of the way that America should use its political, economic power to facilitate deep state corruption around the globe. But I do think he wants out. Now, I think with Trump, you can almost never know for sure what he's saying on foreign policy because so much of it is posturing. You're absolutely right about fundamentally, Trump sees foreign policy as a distraction. He sees foreign governments and foreign entanglements and foreign wars as things that just distract and detract from American policy, America's self-interest, America's economic well-being. He does have a peacenik proclivity. He opposed the Vietnam War in the early 1970s. In the mid 1980s, he volunteered to try to negotiate a peace deal in Central America. For a period of time, he went down there. The CIA told Reagan to pull him out because they said he was a closet peacenik. So there is a proclivity towards that he really doesn't. He has a aversion to war, and that's contra the sort of public perception he likes to make of the machismo. I'm a tough guy. We'll knock out anybody, all the rest. And that's part of his political personality for sure, but it's not really in his bones. If you look, what he bragged about more than anything from his first term was that he entered no new wars while he was president. And he locked himself in to being out of Ukraine at some point and not further escalating and elevating activities in Ukraine by his own positions over the last 4 years, being highly critical of the war, saying it was a dumb war, saying it was a war only because he wasn't president, and so on and so forth. But what he has to navigate is he's got a lot of political will behind him, but he's got an incredibly entrenched deep state, and that deep state has powers in multiple places. It staffs everything. The reason why they took over large parts of the academy and the think tank world is because those people end up writing the policies at the State Department, the Defense Department, even the FBI, even the Justice Department. They're the main staffers on the Hill, in the Senate and the House. That finding dissident, independent, populist voices up there is exquisitely difficult because of how much they've corrupted and co-opted these institutions, as Eisenhower warned in his farewell address in 1961. It's not just the lobbyists. It's not just the defense industry. They've got allies everywhere. And consequently, Trump has adversaries everywhere. Now, their personification of representation, if you want to see what they're thinking in terms of publications, you can, you'll follow the Foreign Relations Committee. You can follow the Foreign Affairs Journal, those kind of places, to some degree, Brookings and Heritage and some others. But for the most part, you can just follow whatever nutty notion Senator Graham has. I don't think Trump is personally friends with Graham. Well, I mean, he really bullied the crap out of Graham and beat him up during the 2016 primaries, so much so that he wanted to make fun of Graham by giving out Graham's cell phone number accidentally to the whole world. So all kinds of people were calling and all the rest. Graham had to change his number. But he does recognize Graham represents this deep state power, and they have power within this. Their main power congressionally is within the Senate. How many people are truly allied with him? Open question. They won't admit these days in the MAGA era, many Republican senators, that they're deep state aligned, but most of them are. They know that the donor class can cut them off. And I can, in fact, give some context for this particular aspect. When I talked to J.D. Vance, when he was running for the Senate in February of 2022 on the question of Ukraine, and he knew of me because of the election work from 2020 and because of the Durant. And so he, like Kennedy, people that are in Gabbard's group, et cetera, watch the show and are fans of the show. And he wanted to get all of my takes on what I thought about Ukraine, much of which was informed by you guys. And so we had a very long conversation. And at the end of it, he had a policy determination that further engagement in Ukraine was a bad idea, not in America's interest, would be bad for American soldiers, would be bad for America writ large. Yeah. But he said, here's going to be my hurdle. He goes, if I take this position on this issue, I'm going to start getting funding problems for my campaign. There's all of a sudden going to be a lot of money coming into my opposition. There's going to be hit pieces on me in the Wall Street Journal the next day. I'm going to have the media, the think tank, the donor class all aligned against me. And he goes, so is it consequential that I make a public policy position now at the very beginning of my Senate campaign in Ohio that could derail my entire political future? And we're talking to him, I was like, why are you running? I mean, he was already wealthy between the book, the movie deal, and the tech investments. He was already famous. I highly recommend people want to watch. The film is available in the U.S. and maybe around the world, depending on where you're at, on Netflix, about J.D. Vance's life story. That's Hillbilly Elegy, the really good depiction of where he came up, what his background was. But I remember saying, I was like, why? I was like, why are you running? You know, you have wealth, you have fame. And he said he was running because he doesn't want other soldiers to experience what he experienced when he volunteered for Iraq based on a political lie. And he's like, I'm not going to see more people die for a lie. And that, by the way, is an underestimated aspect of, like, Pete Hegseth has the same view. Others have, because I've talked to Hegseth about this. So others have this same view that they felt betrayed by the Iraq war. Betrayed not by the military, betrayed by the deep state, betrayed by American politicians, betrayed by the American press, that they saw their brothers. This is Memorial Day here in the United States. A hat tip to all the veterans. Suffer death, suffer disability, suffer lifelong injury. People like Richard Barris, People's Pundit Daily, the best American pollster by far, that's out there. You can follow him on YouTube, Rumble, and other places. He had the same experience. They felt personally betrayed by that war, and they have not forgotten. They have not forgiven, and they'll hold the line where they can. And that's why he's like, I'm going to go ahead and take this position. He was the only major Senate candidate at the time in either party to come out right away at the very beginning of the conflict and say, we're not going to get further involved in Ukraine. I'm not going to support a no-fly zone. I'm not going to support any of it. I ended up winning, and then he ended up becoming vice president. And in fact, I would say he's the future of America's foreign policy is going to be J.D. Vance. Trump is here for 4 years. We can ignore Steve Bannon talking about running a third term, all that. That's not happening. And Trump will step back because Trump's not trying to build a movement. Trump's just Trump. A movement has come up around him. But the person who is trying to build a movement to intellectually restructure America's foreign policy is Vice President Vance. And they have their allies. Robert Kennedy's on the Vance side of the aisle. Tulsi Gabbard's on the Vance side of the aisle. Pete Hegseth is on the Vance side of the aisle. And then there are the people that Trump has brought in. Every bad faith actor in the Trump administration that will fail will have connections to a particular institute. It's the America First Policy Institute. Not to be confused with America First Legal. America First Legal is Stephen Miller, very smart, capable, able advocate on Trump, principally on immigration policy, and on discrimination policy. America First Policy Institute was one of these fake America First groups that was funded by Big Oil out of Texas. It was connected to former Governor Rick Perry. That their goal was to divert Trump's movement back towards mainstream institutional conservatism. To them, as you point out, Alexander, America first for Trump literally means America first. It means worry about America first, American workers first, American safety first, American security first. And all these deep state and economic globalist priorities he sees as anti-American first, and the hurdle, the obstacle, the problem for America to be able to reach the peace and prosperity he wants it to obtain. America First Policy Institute wants to recreate that as the America number one, that, going to dominate the world. And you get some of these uber macho fake, Mike Waltz is one of these guys that, America First means we're number one here and we're number one here and we're the unipolar power of the world and da da da. That is not at all what Trump means or any of Trump's voters mean by America First, a term borrowed from the protest movement against World War II in the 1940s. That they thought was a slur, by the way. New York Times thought they were slurring Trump. Said, my God, he sounds like an America First guy. And Trump read it and was like, oh, I love that. America First. That's it. And I thought he grabbed it. He grabbed it from a slur and he made it into a campaign. So what Trump is trying to navigate is the deep-seated corruption of American power and politics by the deep state military industrial complex national security apparatus that uses and their tools are, they got allies in the Justice Department, they got allies in the judiciary, they got allies in the Senate, they got allies in the media, they got allies in the think tank world. So and they've proven to him very personally how they can escalate his individual risk if he challenges their agenda. Trump's advantages, his assets, is he has the American people on his side. That the American people are done with this. They've been done with it for a while. They never voted for it. They never supported it. They never embraced it. That the only times they've been able to engage in deep state popular support is when they lied to him. When they lied to him about aspects of the Cold War, lied to him about the Iraq War, lied the first Iraq War, lied to him about the second Iraq War. And we've all seen and witnessed the utter disastrous debacle that is deep state foreign policy for the last century. And especially the last half century, where the net effect has been that, the Korean War didn't work out, Vietnam War didn't work out, Afghanistan War didn't work out, overthrowing Libya didn't work out, overthrowing Iraq didn't work out, overthrowing Syria didn't work out. At what point do we say enough's enough? Enough idiocy is enough idiocy. How much death of American soldiers do we need on this Memorial Day before we say enough of deep state power and corruption of America's founding principles, which is based on America first, not getting involved and intertwined and engaged in dumb and stupid wars around the world. So Trump is going to keep trying to navigate that. You can ignore most of his public statements and just look at it. I thought what Alex did this morning, read the very end of Trump's Truth Post. Ignore the rest.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where Trump is really going on Ukraine, is what he says at the end, which is to follow you guys' advice from 6 months ago, which I think he would have done 6 months ago, but for his concerns of deep state power in America.
I think this is all absolutely correct about the Truth Social post. I mean, I read it, and the way the European media in particular have taken it and distorted it and are reporting it in completely the wrong way. I mean, they're focusing on the first few words and ignoring the main part of it, which is completely different to what they think. But look, there's a huge amount that you said there, and I think let's take it first step by step. Firstly, no politician in the United States in the last 30 years, 40, going back to the 60s, has been subjected to the kind of pressures that Donald Trump has been. I mean, 2 impeachments, massive investigations, attempts to kill him, attempts to discredit him, attempts to prosecute him on every kind of absurd, phony charge, and absolutely phony charge. Now, that tells you a great deal about the kind of person that Donald Trump is, because there is no doubt at all that these attacks are organized and coordinated. I mean, it is impossible that they could be otherwise. If you think that they are not organized at some level, you do not know how politics works. That is the first thing to say. I mean, that's absolutely clear and obvious, at least to me. The second is contrast what I would say his core supporters are saying. Go and read and listen to someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, I don't know how interesting you find her. I find her a most interesting politician, far more sophisticated and understanding of politics and of political currents in the United States than the Europeans understand. The Europeans do not take her seriously. I think she should be taken extremely seriously. Go and read what journals like The Federalist, which I always read, by the way, I read it every day. Again, I find it a most interesting media outlet. Go to Robert's programs, your own programs. You could get a very, very good sense of what is being said and discussed amongst people like that. And it's, on the one hand, very different from what you would be led to think if you took your views about Trump's electoral base from the European media, the American mainstream media, the various commentariats, the political leaders in the West, and all of those sort of people. Just actually read them and see what they're saying. And I think you get a completely different image and sense of what these people are really about. And it's exactly what Robert has been saying, that they don't want to involve the United States in more wars. There is a very powerful, very well argued and coherent piece today, for example, was it maybe yesterday I read it, in The Federalist, saying that the United States absolutely does not need war with Iran. I mean, they may not like Iran, they may not be sympathetic to Iran, but they say, this is not America's business. It's only going to cause us more trouble, more death, destruction, more loss of money, resources, diversion from all the things that the United States needs to do and which it is truly and actually about. So if you understand the base of the political leader, you'll be able to understand a lot more things about him. And remember, Trump and his base, I accept that Donald Trump is himself, but there is a strong connection between the two. I mean, the one has brought about the other, and there's no doubt at all that, he's created a huge resonance. Now, about J.D. Vance, I would say that I find him the most impressive, one of the most impressive political leaders in the world at the moment. If we were to get a J.D. Vance presidency, I would be extremely excited. I hope we do. And certainly, I do get the sense that he is somebody who thinks very deeply and very hard. And he does something which is completely unique in foreign policy terms. So he actually looks at the facts. He actually goes out there, researches them. I mean, the Lindsey Grahams and all of those people, they don't really wrestle with facts. They lead the United States into wars without actually studying in advance the adversary, the country that they're taking on, the actual interests of the United States. They don't seem to be interested in any of those things. And they always proceed from a assumption of infinite power that they can bring to bear on any problem, which by itself guarantees success. Now, that's a mystical point of view. It is not a fact-based one. Now, about Lindsey Graham, I've actually been looking into him, and I've had some rather interesting emails about him. People who provide me with some discussions and provided me with some explanations of where his support comes from, the fact that he's backed by people at certain old families in Charleston, which I find quite interesting, that there is a very, very substantial presence of the military-industrial complex in his state, and that he is deeply connected to all of that. I mean, you get a sense of a politician who is at the center of a nexus of power that is both extremely strong in his state itself, and which he represents, but also which extends across the whole of the rest of the United States. So all of the things that Robert has been saying, if you actually spend time looking into them, and it does take time, you begin to see how it all comes together and all fits together. There is one thing that I personally as a person who used to work in the High Court in London, am profoundly shocked by and would never have imagined. And that is the way in which a large section of the legal world, the legal community, the judicial system, the law enforcement system appears to have been taken over by all of this. Now, I don't mean here the FBI, because about the FBI, I never assumed otherwise. For as far as I'm concerned, the FBI is better understood as an intelligence agency than anything else, basically. But the judiciary of the United States has astonished me. And look at the way in which Donald Trump, he makes orders, which, as far as I can see, they're well within the scope of presidential prerogatives. And we have a judge, a federal judge in some state, and he makes orders and he says these decisions of Trump's, these actions of Trump are suspended across the entire territory of the United States. Now, I have to say, I just cannot get my head around that at all. It is so different from the concept of judicial review, which is, I presume, what this is, that I am used to and familiar with in England. That, I mean, just to talk about judicial overreach here, I mean, those words don't adequately convey the extent of it. But to repeat again, it is clearly organized. You cannot imagine this happening to the extent that it is happening unless there is a purpose behind it. And the purpose is clearly to stop this movement that Donald Trump represents and his administration in its tracks. Now, I would like some explanations as to how this has come about within the federal justice system of the United States, because I just cannot fathom how judicial review, even in a constitutional system like the American one, can have evolved to this point. It absolutely does not happen in England. I used to work very, very closely with the administrative court in England, which is the court that deals with judicial review. I know judicial review in the English terms backwards. I know its history and how it evolved out of the prerogative orders, which I presume is, to some extent at least, its history in the United States as well. And as I said, I just cannot understand how judges are able to, on incredibly thin argumentation, make orders of this kind, stopping the president of the United States, the elected president of the United States, in his tracks for months at the time with just a flick of the pen. So over to you, Robert.
Briefly on Lindsey Graham. Somebody will wonder, okay, why doesn't Trump just take action? It's because when he's taken even little bits of actions, he's got massive blowback. The power of Lindsey Graham is in the Senate. He, Tom Tillis, and Mitch McConnell can combine to block Trump's nominees, to block Trump's budget, to block Trump's tariffs, to block anything Trump wants to do on any aspects of domestic policy. Now, he has counter leverage. Two of those three, all three may be gone by 2026. Mitch McConnell's retiring. Of the other two, Lindsey Graham's up for re-election in 2026. Tom Tillis in North Carolina is up for re-election in 2026. You're absolutely right. South Carolina has a lot of deep state power, a lot of Boeing, a lot of military industrial complex contractors, and the rest. But what shocked Graham and others was the 2016 primary results. That the assumption was that if Trump went into South Carolina and called out George W. Bush to Jeb Bush's face in front of the whole world on the Iraq War being a disaster and maybe his brother should have been impeached over it, the assumption was there'll be massive blowback because people like Graham really thought their positions were popular in the state, representing old school military conservatism. But the reality of military conservatism in the United States is it's mostly an anomaly of the Cold War. That America's politics, go back and look, who voted against NATO? Senator Robert Taft, representing Midwestern populist republicanism from the same state now J.D. Vance represents in Ohio. Go back to 1964, who votes against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? It's a conservative Republican from Eastern Kentucky. That's where historically the anti-war tendency, opposition to a standing army, was, back to my ancestors at the time of the American Revolution. That the opposed originally the original constitutional government because it didn't have a Bill of Rights yet attached to it. They had to promise that to get it through. So that's the longer political tradition that's been buried. I think the deep state was done a big favor by the left hijacking the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. And what that did is it allowed the deep state to demonize anti-war politics as pro-communist politics, as anti-American politics. William Buckley was part of this with the John Birch Society going all the way back, where he basically gatekept the conservative movement to purge it of its populist traditions. This is what George W. Bush said when he says he's against isolationism, protectionism, and nativism. This was the establishment Republican view, but it is divorced from Republican history. And as Republican consultants found out in 2016, it's divorced from the modern Republican Party. You're right. The modern Republican Party is much better represented by Marjorie Taylor Greene than Lindsey Graham. For others out there, if you want to get a real sense of the zeitgeist of what's happening in the populist base in America, I recommend that they follow someone they may think of as an esoteric conspiracy theorist, but 90% of his policy and politics he talks about is everyday politics, and that's Alex Jones. For those who are wondering, people thought it was some kind of weird symbol. This is InfoWars mug for Alex Jones. Alex has been one of the he is the best representative and the most popular. You look at wide range of independent media surveys, more than 10% of Americans follow him on a day-to-day basis. This is the guy that Trump went and appeared on because he recognized his significance and consequence. And he's been one of the big, he's pro Ed Snowden, he's pro Julian Assange, he's anti-war, he's anti-deep state, anti-surveillance state, and he's had these positions consistently for 2 decades. And he's the most popular conservative podcaster or talk show host in the country. Now that with the passing of Rush Limbaugh. And so that gives you, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, what her number one source of information is on a regular basis? It's Alex Jones. So there tends to be this caricature of America, ordinary people, as being some sort of bloodthirsty empire ravaging around the world. And, it's an old left narrative that just is belied by the actual history if you study it. And if someone has the perception of Trump as he's just an imperial colonialist who wants to put Trump hotels around the world, you're not going to be able to adequately or accurately predict what he's going to do in policy and politics. Now Trump's leverage on Tillis and on he has none on McConnell, unfortunately. I had advised people that McConnell's involved in a lot of crime. His wife's involved in a lot of crime. His whole family's connected to various money laundering activities and other activities. That a way to maybe remind McConnell is to take a page out of Putin's books or others that, Putin goes to the oligarchs in the early 2000s and says, look, you can keep your ill-gotten gains. You're only going to pay a small amount of tax, but keep your head down politically and stop stealing and stop interfering in Russian politics, and you'll be okay. A few didn't get the message, so they got an extended vacation to Siberia. The rest did. Some fled to Britain and other places where they got to hang out and hide out and the like. But including Bill Browder, totally corrupt actor, and all the rest. To give you an idea of how fake Dan Bongino was, he thought Bill Browder was a legit guy. If you think that, you're too clueless to work in the FBI. You just are. But putting that aside, the other great obstacle Trump faces, is, as you point out, is the sort of economic globalist. That's the other. Deep state is the biggest obstacle to him getting success in terms of minimizing war abroad, which for Trump, in part, even if you don't accept my assumption based on a long history of studying Trump and knowing him about his peacenik proclivities, let's just put it down to money. Trump sees war as costing money. He doesn't see war as profiting. He sees it as very rare. Now, at least he's honest about it. He's like, hey, if we're actually going to do a war, at least get the oil, steal the oil. It's always funny how he's so blunt about that, but about what these wars are really about in some cases. He just sees as money wasting. He sees foreign aid as money wasting. He sees all this crap we're sending to Ukraine as money wasted. He did the minerals deal so he could have a sellable package coming back, because otherwise he thinks it's all a waste of money. Though I don't think he thinks that has any teeth or roots to it long term. If you look at Trump's sort of broad global policy agenda, and I think it's the best way to filter. If you hear Trump say something about anything, because you might hear one thing one day, another thing, another day, another thing over here, Trump is posturing for leverage. But the leverage he's trying to create sometimes is with the people he's negotiating with. Sometimes it's with dealing with domestic constituencies, whether it's his own voter base or dealing with the deep state. And that's where he's doing, like his statement yesterday was a combination of that, a hybrid of that. Okay, I'm going to criticize Putin to satisfy the deep state. I'm going to criticize Zelensky to satisfy my base. But you look at the very end and you figure out what he's actually up to. He's planning what J.D. Vance let the cat out of the bag a couple of weeks ago in a Fox interview that the media buried, because I didn't see it until one of our board members shared it with me, where Vance said, we're going to get out. If it doesn't work, we're going to get out, which, by the way, is Vance's general view. Vance has an old school American view that Europe is a problem. Europe is a burden. Europe is an obstacle. Europe is a trap. Same view that Senator Taft had, said, don't join NATO. And that was at the peak of the beginning of the Cold War. We have no more Cold War rationale for NATO's existence. Trump in 2016 said, why don't we get out of NATO? That in Trump instinctually is on that same side, though he doesn't intellectualize the issues in the same way that Vance does. But the economic globalists are the other obstacle he faces, and their main power is economic. So sometimes the economic globalists and the deep state warmongers are aligned. Sometimes they're not. To give an example on China, they can actually be divorced. There's aspects of the deep state that want a kinetic conflict with China, that want China to be the subordinate, submissive factory worker to the world. And whereas you have some on the economic globalist side that see kinetic conflict as a problem, as a hurdle to globalism, as a hindrance to globalism, though they have an economic globalist perspective. So like Jeffrey Sachs generally comes from the economic globalist school, but he sees kinetic conflict as a hindrance rather than a help to that. And so Jeffrey Sachs, Harvard-trained economist, was very involved in he's a very big proponent of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, those kind of institutions, involved in Bolivia. Shock therapy was one of his ideas in Bolivia and Poland. And then rather famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, they tried it in Russia. Russians still are bitter about shock therapy, kind of discredited on a global stage. But economic globalism, he fundamentally supports. He believes that trade benefits everybody, no matter what, that benefits both sides, no matter what. And thinks economic globalism will bring more peace and more prosperity. I disagree with him on that. That's why Sachs is aligned with Soros. Soros funds a lot of his foundations and think tanks. And so he has a very different perspective on China than the Vance Trump populist wing of the Republican Party does. So but the economic globalists have profited immensely from this structure. Now, it's only a small percentage. Like, you look at what economic globalism has done to the working classes of the West, and it has utterly devastated the working classes of the West, no matter how you measure it. That's why you're seeing Brexit and Reform Party surge in the UK. That's why you're seeing Le Pen go from being a southern French movement to a northeastern mining town French movement. That's why you're seeing aspects of it through Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, combined with cultural conservatism in some of those countries that don't like the wokeism or in open borders, like in Poland, like in Hungary, like in Italy. The economic globalism is its failures to deliver to America's working class and the working classes of the West is why you're seeing these mass protests against institutions like the EU or bad trade policies, as they see it, inflicting such economic harm on them. And to put it in real terms, their wages have gone down, their incomes have gone down, their pensions have gone down, housing and healthcare and education is more unaffordable and inaccessible for them than it has ever been. Levels, if you look at young working class men, the biggest group trending towards Trump between 2012 and 2024, often minority, often African-American, Hispanic, or Asian, but that they're millennial and Zoomer generation. And why are they surging it? Well, look at the underlying data. Their economic well-being, their material foundation of their communities have been ripped apart. This is where J.D. Vance comes from, a more communitarian tradition in that respect. He's not a pure free market guy. That he doesn't think of a free market that leads a community to be devastated is not going to have a happy ending to hillbilly elegy. And so from their perspective, they believe that they want to overthrow the entire globalist order. Deep state foreign policy and economic globalist worldwide. That is a revolution. There was no way it was going to happen easily or quickly. And in the U.S., we have institutional obstacles. And those institutional obstacles are a representative branch that's unrepresentative. Unlike when you win, say, with a parliamentary system, you might have a lot more control over your own representatives. The president of the United States does not, because they're independently elected. They're not as dependent upon him for their elections in the first place. And they are to a degree, but not to the same degree. And so there isn't the same party discipline that Trump can impose. So people like Graham can hold him up on things in the Senate. Other members can hold him up on things in the House. And then you have the bureaucracy that can just sabotage and sabotage and sabotage. And here in the U.S., they've decided they're permanently entitled to those positions, that they're not only immune from elections, they're immune from those officials that get elected in those elections. So much so that even though we have a federal service merit board, you're supposed to go through a court of claims. If you have a contract dispute, you're supposed to go through. When Trump, like you look at USAID, that was fantastic. I mean, the finally taking apart the money tree that is the financial source of this economic globalist deep state war agenda is USAID, is NED, these, aligned with their non-governmental organizations. People always want, why does some foreign country ban non-governmental organizations? Because those non-governmental organizations aren't really non-governmental. They're aligned with these deep state institutional interests, whether globalist or war-oriented, into perpetrating it around the world and using federal taxpayer funds to facilitate it. But what happens when he tries to take it apart? All the agencies go nuts. Congress threatens investigations, and their biggest ally institutionally right now is the court system, is the American federal judiciary. And there was a good book written a couple of years ago about the professional managerial class and how you could probably blame almost all the world's problems over the last century over the rise of a professional managerial class in power. Fascism, communism, neoliberal corporatism, whatever you want to, whatever ideological reference point you want to make, you often find a professional managerial class giving power to itself. It's always some excuse for power to itself. It's like our welfare policies are not let's help poor people. It's let's hire a bureaucrat in the name of helping poor people. This is why so much of the foreign aid that comes from the United States, less than 10 cents on a dollar, actually goes to wherever it is supposed to go in the first place. Zelensky accidentally let this out. He's like, a lot of the money doesn't really come to us. No, duh, dimwit, but that's what you're there for. You're there for to be the poster boy so they can drag in a bunch of cash for their pals and allies in places like Arlington, Virginia, more than Kiev, Ukraine. And so that's the scam. But the people now protecting that scam are the federal judicial branch. And they represent the biases and prejudices and parochialisms of the professional managerial class. America's founders, the anti-federalists, for example, who opposed the constitutional change from the Articles of Confederation in the U.S. Constitution, one of their main objections was the creation of a federal judicial branch. And they said the problem is this will become an aristocratic branch of government, and every aristocratic branch of government in history has ended up becoming an oligarchy, almost without fail. It's been interesting watching Putin try to experiment with a American-style legal system, but you've seen some hesitance, like he likes aspects of it, but distrusts other aspects of it, and this is why. And for the kind of criticism that the courts came in under, you can go no further than President Thomas Jefferson, who hated what the federal judiciary was becoming, and in order to try to tame them, impeached the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase, and almost got him removed. But it sent a message to the federal courts, hey, back off being so openly political. But he would spend the next 2 decades warning about the dangers of the federal judicial branch. The next man to do it was President Andrew Jackson, who famously told the Supreme Court, Chief Justice made his ruling, now he can go enforce it. And then he would have conflicts with him both over Indian removal and on the second bank of the United States. The latter being the bigger constitutional confrontation potentially, because he said it was unconstitutional. The court said it was. He said, I don't care. We're disbanding it. Then you had Abraham Lincoln. Well, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus before Congress had authorized it. The Constitution authorized it in case of invasion or insurrection. And the courts tried to stop him from doing it. He didn't care. He did it anyway. And had very negative things to say about the federal judicial branch. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, the 4 horsemen are going to be the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, referring to those 4 anti-New Deal judges that were leading the Supreme Court to strike down every form of reform legislation to protect labor or others. And he said, well, you guys seem really busy up there. I'm going to help you out. I'm going to add, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, however many more we need. And all of a sudden they got the message and backed off. But now we're seeing the ultimate judicial coup of the Americans' election. I mean, you're seeing little glimpses of it around the world. Like you see it in the Romanian courts deciding who can and can't run for office as directed by the EU. You see it occasionally with the EU court making rulings as to Hungary and trying to intervene in their politics and undermine Orban, who is still Trump. And that's another way to understand Trump. Who's his best friend in Europe? It's Orban. That gives you an idea of what he really thinks. Meloni is trying to replace Orban. It's not going to work. She's going to kiss up well, but she's not Orban because Orban ideologically and intellectually shares the same assumptions and presumptions that Trump has. So the federal, I try to warn a lot of the Trump people, the federal judiciary is going to wage war on it. But the fact that they've done it in every capacity. They've told him who he can hire and who he can fire. They've told him what money can go out and money can't. I mean, they're actually saying he has to keep giving money to these bogus NGOs, that he keeps spending money on this ridiculous Radio Free America and Radio Free Europe. I mean, these are deep state apparatus and operations ever since their inception and origination. Now, Carrie Lake is a very much populist reformer on the Trump team. What does she do? She's like, we're going to redo all this. We're going to take away all this. We're not going to give money to all your Democratic pals and allies and deep state pals and allies. And we're going to restructure this to actually make it about news rather than and portray America in a positive light, but not be involved in all this other shenanigans and nonsense. And what does the federal court do? Say, no, you can't do that. You got to keep our personnel in there, our friends in there, allies. Many of these judges have friends and family that are receiving money that they're making rulings on, which is just the most egregious conflict of interest one could imagine. And yet now I think Trump kind of baited him on this. If he wanted to red pill the normie American as to how corrosively corrupt and dangerous to constitutional liberty the federal judiciary has become in America, the best way to get them to do it is to issue inane and insane rulings on immigration and the most egregious immigration cases. Right? It's not like the sweet, little grandma who's been here, 30 years and whatever, helps out the local household. That isn't who he focused on. He said, let's take the worst, most dangerous illegals that are here. Let's deport them. Let's use traditional remedies, summary deportation, summary removal. Let's use the Alien Enemies Act and these other laws that give direct authority to the president to remove anybody that's illegally present here. And if you were not legally present here to begin with, your only process to which you are due is deportation under American constitutional law that goes back more than a century. But these courts can't help themselves. They so obsessively hate Trump, and they believe they should run the world. If you think like a EU commissioner, you can understand how these federal judges think in America. The same mindset. As they stole from Alex, they're all Ursula von der crazies. Across the board. That's all you got. Vander crazy. And you're just begging them not to be crazy today. And so the net effect is they have issued, now they're ordering, they're intervening and interfering in foreign diplomacy, right? So there were a couple of murderers, rapists, and pedophiles who had long been ordered removed to southern Sudan. There's only a few of them. There wasn't like a huge number. I think it's 5 or 6. We finally get around to removing them. And the federal judiciary kind of takes a political bait because there's no way this is going to look good for them long term. But a federal judge comes in and says, nah, you can't remove them to Sudan. And if they're in Sudan, you got to keep them there. You got to give them nice room, food, and housing. You have them 10 days for this, 20 days for that, 30 days for this, to go through this process, that process, another process. They're ordering that he take people that have already been removed, that were never legally here, that are convicted criminals and dangerous crimes, and bring them back here. That the TDA, the Venezuelan gang, that the Trump administration's perception is that the current Venezuelan President Maduro kind of authorized TDA to come to the United States, both to solve Venezuela's internal crime problem on the eve of their election, but also as payback to the United States for his various sanctions policies. That's how they perceive it. There's debates about the accuracy of that, but that is what the U.S. believes under this administration. So, and these are some of the worst, most violent gang members anywhere. I mean, so they just, their method of criminal organization empowerment is to just be more violent than the next guy. If you're even more dangerous, more extreme, more violent, you will be able to gain and obtain power quickly on a rapid basis. And they were throughout large parts of Latin and Central America. But they come to the United States, they're a perfect target, a political foil, if you will, for Trump. But the courts are coming and say, no, they got to be here too. So over 60% of the country wants mass deportations. Least of all, and 80% with deportations of anybody that's been ordered removed that has a criminal record of any seriousness. Not like a traffic ticket or anything like that, but serious crimes, domestic violence, battery, assault, robbery, rape, murder, etc. Gang member affiliation, you name it. And they're intervening in all of that, interfering in all of that. And the only question is, does the Supreme Court in the next several weeks pull back from the cliff that they are on of a constitutional confrontation? I don't consider it a constitutional crisis, because the Constitution gives this power to the president, as the courts themselves have acknowledged for more than a century. It's a constitutional confrontation of a federal judiciary that thinks it knows best, and the American people are wrong. And it's like the Romanian court that said, nah, you can't pick who you want for president. It's like the EU court saying, nah, we're going to decide and dictate what your domestic policy is going to be against the will of your domestic population. And it's just on steroids and on scale because it's the United States of America and it's the federal judiciary. And either the Supreme Court's going to step in and hem in these excesses. They might say no more nationwide injunctions. They might say no more injunctions other than the parties of the case. They might say no more injunctions to putative classes until an actual class exists, though they have contradicted that themselves in recent rulings. And if they don't, then there's going to be a direct constitutional confrontation. At some point, Trump will not endanger the safety of the country in the name of the federal judicial branch. So if he is forced he is affording them, some would say enough rope to hang themselves, others would say enough rope to fix the problem. But it's going to be up to the Supreme Court and most likely Chief Justice Roberts, because unfortunately, as I predicted, Justice Amy Coney Barrett was going to be a complete traitor. This is what happens when you let the Southern aristocracy run things. As you pointed out, Alexander, Lindsey Graham's ties go back to the Southern aristocracy around Charleston. This is an old slave-holding would-be caste of people that think they should run the world and they know better than the rest of us. The same mindset in North Carolina. It was Republicans that betrayed the black Trump supporter, Mark Robinson, who was running for governor there. They were the ones who leaked it to the media and the Democratic Party in order to sabotage because they didn't want to be governed by a black populace. That other old Southern aristocracy used to dominate the Republican Party in the Bush era. It doesn't now. They've been overthrown. Trump has overthrown them. They just don't realize it yet. And what you have is a bunch of aristocratic elites represented in the judicial branch, bureaucratic branch, think tanks, academia, like Harvard, who thinks they're just above the law and all the rules. They can violate everything and be held immune because they think they are the beacon of American representation. When the ordinary American sees them as a bunch of elite, out-of-touch snobs that want to impose their foreign values on the rest of us, and they're often working against the interest of America. Most Americans don't know almost half of students at U.S. universities in the Ivy League come from foreign nations. I mean, G felt so comfortable with Harvard, he sent his own daughter there. So that's not exactly America first Harvard. No one really confused Harvard with America first, to be blunt about it. So I think fighting the economic globalists on the one hand, that's what his tariff and trade and industrial policy is about, and fighting the deep state on global war policy will be his two principal and primary obstacles, because he has the support of the American people. He has good policies and ideas as the American people see it. But he's going to have to get the federal judiciary to stop blocking his immigration plans and his policy and personnel changes. He's going to have to get Congress to back off, Lindsey Graham to back off extortionate threats in order to get through Ukraine, which I think they mapped out ahead of time, the same conclusion that you came to 6 months ago, which was, I think Trump advanced, which was that the only way to exit Ukraine is to exit Ukraine. But the only way to exit Ukraine is to build up enough support so that the would-be saboteurs don't have the means and the method to be able to undermine him when he does it. I mean, like yesterday's announcement was almost a perfect announcement of that. I only cared about what he said at the end. Except saying Putin was crazy. Oh, Ukraine tried to murder him, and so he said, "Payback. Hey, here's a little hello in Kiev." I mean, Trump would have done twice as much as what Putin did. But I was like, I don't think Trump really believes that at some level. He wants out, and he thinks the only way to get out is to build enough of a narrative of, golly gee, I really tried, and I was really fair, and I was hostile, I was harsh and tough on both sides, and see, golly gee, even though it just didn't work out. But on the trade policy, he is absolutely sincere, which apparently the EU and the European leaders are still befuddled by Trump. Kellogg, by the way, that same America First Policy Institute that's creating so many problems in the Trump administration, Brooke Rollins, Secretary of Agriculture, who's underdelivered from that institute, helped found it. The Kash Patel was employed by them, a sign that maybe he wasn't going to deliver on his big words. The Pam Bondi, Attorney General, also associated with him. Probably another sign she wasn't going to deliver. His chief of staff, Susie Wiles, deep state swamp character going back decades, big lobbyist of a lot of people. A very good disciplinarian, no doubt about that, but also not trustworthy on populist positions. But last but not least, the lead foreign military advisor for the America First Policy Institute is the one and only don't buy this at the store, Kellogg. So I can't believe he really believes in Kellogg. The guy is the kind of idiot that Trump would usually make fun of behind the scenes. And I hope that Kellogg was just there to sucker the Europeans and the neocons and deep state apparatus in the U.S. into thinking maybe Trump would continue the Ukrainian conflict. But stepping back from it, looking at this global set of policies, and the best way to filter Trump is, okay, who's he trying to leverage by this public statement? But the second filter I use to try to figure out what Trump is up to, and I recommend people watch his interview with Joe Rogan. That was one of his most revelatory, most open, honest, and transparent. Yeah, Rogan asked him, "How are you going to get peace in Ukraine?" He's like, "Well, I would never tell you that. I would never tell anybody that." He goes, and what he's saying is, nothing I say publicly is actually necessarily my position. It's purely for posturing. It's purely for leverage in these issues. But if you look at what his global interests are, his broad scale foreign policy, he needs the cost of living down. Number one issue that he got elected on was the cost of living. He sees the number one input cost to the cost of living as energy. That's part one. Part two, this is an underappreciated aspect of Trump, but you can find some interviews over time where he talks about what his uncle John Trump, who was a famous scientist at MIT, that the government hired to go in and look at Tesla's documents to see if Tesla's inventions had validity on a go-forward basis from a national security perspective. He talks about how his uncle John repeatedly emphasized the incredible danger of nuclear war. And so Trump's actually been obsessed with it in his own way. This will come out in honest, transparent, and just little bits and pieces. If you watch him and study him over time, but nuclear non-proliferation is a real objective that Trump has globally. And then part 30 is restructuring global economics to focus on national interest, not globalist interest, and to put the working class, in this case, America, first, rather than global economic financial capital interest. If you look at those three, his two big groups of opposition will be economic globalists who have a lot of money in the equity markets, a lot of money in the stock markets, a lot of money in asset markets, a lot of money in real estate markets, particularly in the West, even though it's creating a disaster. Housing bubble, unaffordability in Canada, housing bubble, unaffordability in Britain, housing inaccessibility, unaffordability, and bubble in Australia. Same thing is happening in the United States. Our housing market is frozen because housing prices have doubled. It's the highest percentage of median income in the history of the United States. This is unsustainable. But there are people who made a lot of money on it, and they can use that money to sink markets the moment he tries to deviate from the things that have made them fantastically and fabulously rich. But Trump is sincere, absolutely, on a trade, tariff, industrial policy in the sort of Kevin Phillips school of thought. His perception is, we'll get to that in a bit. But if you look at those three priorities, that tells you how he's most likely to interact with Russia and Putin. He needs Putin and Russia as an ally to keep oil prices down. He needs Putin and Russia as an ally to get nuclear non-proliferation. Biggest nuclear power in the world is Russia, not the United States. And on the restructuring economics on trade, Russia's not an adversary at all. Russia can even be an ally. He doesn't see Russia stealing American jobs. So he could see, he sees China as doing so. But Russia could be an ally in regards to that, as opposed to an adversary, a critical adversary potentially, because his global trade policy isn't just China; it's to replace China in everybody else's markets. So it's a bifurcated to restore and re-onshore American manufacturing and industry, which he believes is essential not only to national security but long-term economic prosperity for working class people and populations. And in that regard, he has the same view as, say, President McKinley or our founders, people like Alexander Hamilton, who believed in industrial policy and so forth. But that's why I think it's very unlikely we ever get serious sanctions against Russia. If you ever see them announced, Trump will find 100 ways to have 100 loopholes in it, so it's not really meaningful. But it's why he's very unlikely to get further dragged down into a Ukrainian conflict, and why it's unlikely he'll have any permanent opposition to Russia and Putin, because he needs him for his primary objectives in foreign policy, which is mostly, as you point out, about domestic policy.
Yeah, lots of things to say. Let us start with that Truth Social post, because I think, getting to understand why Trump wrote it at all, in fact, explains it. So the Russians launch a combined drone and missile strike at Kiev. Zelensky, Churchill, as he now has practically become here in Britain, starts complaining that the Americans are silent about this. So when Zelensky talks about this, you can be absolutely sure that he's been told to say this, and you can imagine immediately that the phone lines are buzzing, and they're calling Washington, and they're calling their friends in Washington, and they're saying, why isn't Trump coming out and speaking out against this missile attack? I mean, is it a sign that he's basically on Putin's side. So you can see the pressure, and you can imagine the pressure. So what Trump does is he writes a Truth Social post in which he says, this missile strike really isn't good at all. Shows that, Putin is off his mind. And then he goes on and says a whole lot of other things about Zelensky. And then he ends by saying, this isn't my war. In fact, whenever Trump talks about Ukraine, the one line that he constantly repeats, and by the way, it's something that Alex Christoforou said he should do months and months ago. The one line he constantly repeats is, this is not my war. It's Putin's war, maybe. It's Zelensky's war. It's Joe Biden's war. It's absolutely not my war. This was a post, a message that he had to put out on Truth Social. It was a piece of political management. And that is all it is. You can see exactly how it came about. You can see exactly the pressure that was exerted on him. It was all over the media here in Europe. It was all over with comments from European governments and European officials. They put the pressure on the White House, and Trump stopped it by just putting out this Truth Social post, which ultimately doesn't mean very much. As I said, 6 of one, half a dozen at the other, but it's not my war at the end of the way. I want to get us out. So that's the first thing to say. Now, the other thing about Lindsey Graham, and this is a point about the whole sanctions package that he's putting forward, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not new to politics. I had to deal with politics quite a lot, and I saw how these things are done in London as well. This is all about putting pressure on Donald Trump. That's what it really is. It's not scaring Putin. This sanctions package isn't going to scare or intimidate or influence Putin. It's basically a show of force against Donald Trump, telling him, look, there's 81 senators. I don't believe that, by the way. I don't believe there's 81 senators who really firmly signed up for this thing. There's 81 senators, more than enough to impeach you, who want us to remain fully committed 100% behind Ukraine. And, you go against us at your peril, because, if you don't do as we say, well, we can always activate the sanctions package, and then, you'll be in all kinds of trouble. And if you go against us, we won't start to pass your laws or nominate your people, and or confirm your people rather. And then we might go off and do even more things that you won't like, and ultimately we could impeach you. I don't believe this package has the remotest chance of getting through. I don't think it would get through. I don't think it'd get through Congress. I think if Trump actually opposed it straightforwardly, I think you'd see a lot of the support for it peel away. And it goes completely against Trump's current economic policy. It is completely at odds with it, which at the moment he's trying to reopen trade with China. He's trying, as you correctly say, to keep oil prices down. It makes no sense in those terms. So that's what I would say about that. Now, about globalization and financialization and free markets and the whole school of economics that we have today, in my opinion, all of that originated in Europe in the 1960s. It was very much a product of the evolution of the financial markets in Europe at that time, more before the United States. I remember people talking about euro dollars and things of that kind, for example, and trading in euro dollars, and talking about, all these, restrictions, and we should be allowed to trade absolutely freely and do away with exchange controls that we had in Europe, and which were very much a part of the Bretton Woods system. And it was also very much part of integrating the European economies and bringing them all together and converting the European economic community, which probably always had elements of this, into the thing that we see today. And, that was what the WEF was all about, which is all about ultimately integrating European economies and lifting restrictions on trade making it possible to move money from one part of Europe to another part of Europe, and ultimately taking that whole package and making it global, which is what they started to do when they started to call it, the World Economic Forum. I always forget what its original name was, but when it was set up in the 60s, it was all about Europe. It was the European Economic Forum or something of that kind. So that's as far as I'm concerned, what globalization was all about. And who were behind it? Old European money, as I never cease to point out. If you see the original people who set it up, that was why it all happened in Davos. That's where all these people went skiing. That's where they met each other. That's where they decided, well, wouldn't it be a nice thing to meet in Davos and to talk about these things, between the skiing and the après ski and all of that. And it's, the old money political aristocracy that's been in Europe and who've been running things in Europe ever since. And here I just want to say, just as a quick aside, a thing that people in Europe, and especially my own country, Britain, always get wrong, which is the conservatism in the United States and conservatism in, say, Britain, are actually profoundly different things. In the United States, conservatism is very much connected to the political system, to the Constitution, which is a founding document of the United States to a great extent, not entirely, but to a great extent. It's all about the constitutional political order of the United States, whereas in Europe and in Britain, it is all about preserving the hegemony of the aristocratic traditional political class, which, by the way, in Britain was also the imperial class. So you can already see the difference. So somebody can be deeply conservative in the United States, or at least, say that they're conservative in the United States, but their conservatism is connected to the proper operation of the Constitution and the American political tradition, whereas there is nothing analogous like that in Europe. And in Europe, it's more about keeping the people who have always been in wealth and power there where they still exercise wealth and power. So they are very, very different things. The more I've worked in this area, discussion and commentary, the more I've got to understand the United States. I mean, and I don't pretend to understand the United States fully and completely well. The more I understand and see the differences between my country, Britain, and the United States. And this is also true about what conservatism is. Now, what happened in the United States in the 1950s, starting from the 1950s, is that a strand of American conservatism became Europeanized. And you can see that very closely with some of the people. I mean, Robert mentioned William Buckley. William Buckley was deeply involved in European affairs. He, spoke European languages. His father, who had created the fortune, was for a long time based in Europe. I think William Buckley was partly educated in Europe, for example. And the whole National Review thing basically is all about that. And if you read the National Review to this day, you see this still. It's very much the same sort of conservatism you would get from reading the Daily Telegraph in London, for example. Very different entirely from the kind of conservatism that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, whom I was talking about previously, represents. Now, going back to the whole economic issues, the whole trade policy issues, I'm just going to say one thing here, which is myself having once studied this whole subject long ago, which is that there is a massive body of economic thought, mostly American, by the way, mostly created in the 19th and early 20th century, which looks into all of these questions, looks into protectionism. And protectionism, by the way, was only a part of what used to be called the American system, the whole way of creating the economy of the United States, which is all about, by the way, giving labor high wages so that labor then became not just the producers, but also the consumers as well. And it was all profoundly Republican. It was all connected very much with the United States as a republic, and a republic, which was based on a prosperous, self-confident citizenry. So all of these things were woven together in a very powerful way. Now, I am not sure to what extent people in Donald Trump's circle, people like J.D. Vance, are familiar with this, and it might be useful to them if they went back and started to read it. This body of economic thought that developed in the United States, which was, by the way, antagonistic to economic thinking in Britain at that time, which is all about free trade and laissez-faire and all of those kind of things. That was not American at all. The Americans, as I said, were deeply antagonistic to it. I don't hear very much spoken about it, but it did have influence in Europe in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century as well. So, it's something that's there. It's waiting to be looked at. It's, I think, been massively neglected. It fell into eclipse after the Second World War. There were still residual elements of it still active in America in the 1950s. Basically, it ended its influence in the US in economic schools in the 1960s. But I think it'd be quite interesting to go back and look and understand what they say. And I think if you did that, it might actually help to provide an intellectual underpinning to the kind of program that one senses that people like J.D. Vance especially, and Donald Trump too, are interested in pursuing in the United States today. Now, about the role of the judiciary, I have to also say again that this is very like the European judiciary, just to say this, because, of course, in Europe, and to a great extent even in Britain, the separation of powers concept was something that some intellectuals came up with in Europe in the late 17th and 18th century. But it was never properly applied in Europe, and in Britain it was never applied at all. The judiciary, in theory, are the king's judges in England. They actually don't sit as representatives of the king. When they sit on their thrones in an English courtroom, they are the king. That's why they sit on a throne. They have the royal coats of arms behind them. That's why we bow to them when we enter the courtroom. They are there speaking the king's voice and enforcing the king's law. And we have something like that right across Europe in more different ways. In much of Europe, the judiciary are essentially an administrative arm of the state. That is profoundly true in France, which is the legal system that I know best, by the way. I interconnected quite heavily at one time with French lawyers and with French courts. So I think to some extent what we're seeing in the United States is something of the same thing happening with the judiciary there. They are becoming part of an administrative state, which is, of course, again, completely contrary to the American tradition, which saw judges and courts in a profoundly different way. And Robert spoke about the fact that, Abraham Lincoln exercised his powers as president in ways that the courts didn't like. It's always worth remembering that Lincoln was a lawyer. I am sure Robert will agree with me. When you read his speeches, for me, they read very often like legal arguments. This was a man steeped in the law. And of course, he was also in some ways conservative. He was conservative in the fact that he rooted everything that he did in his own interpretation of the Constitution, which I will accept many, many, many Americans at the time didn't agree with him. But he still looked always back to the Constitution and tried to justify his every action in terms of the Constitution in a way that no European leader would ever conceivably do. Because in Europe, we have nothing that resembles the Constitution of the United States. So that's what I wanted to say.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of that point, when I clerked for a Native American tribe, the Ho-Chunk tribe of Wisconsin, that was setting up its own tribal court system that was designed to interface with non-tribal members, but it was trying to create something that would be credible to both non-tribal members and tribal members. They couldn't get tribal members to partake or participate. That they chose instead the tribal elders. In part, it was recognition of tradition. But the other thing that was fascinating, something I never even thought about, was they had borrowed the American tradition of having the court elevated above everybody else and of wearing robes. And the tribal members would come in and they'd be like, "What the heck is this? What are you doing up there? What are you doing with that robe on?" And I was like, fascinating. It was a true democratizing reminder that you're right. These judicial traditions in America come from royal elites. And then you go further back politically, the old Eastern establishment was notoriously Anglophile. Council of Foreign Relations, notoriously Anglophile. The founders of the CIA and the NSA, deeply enmeshed with MI6 and Brits. I mean, they saw each other as the perfect, the waspish gentleman, the Lawrence of Arabia that's going to free the Arab world, all that kind of thing. And that's very much their mindset. And it's also a good reminder of America's populist tradition is directly contrary to it, directly adversarial to it. Thomas Jefferson was part of the part of the outlier part of the country. The Benjamin Franklin notoriously turned on Britain after Britain turned on him in the American Revolution. The Andrew Jackson came from what was then the frontier of America in Tennessee, my home state. The Abraham Lincoln was from Southern Illinois. The free soil, free labor, free men. That was the movement against abolition. There might have been support from industrialists in the North, but its political support was a very populist one. Whereas the Roosevelts were much more Anglophile. That's why Wilson was very Anglophile. And what Americans remember is Anglophiles get us into dumb wars. Anglophiles undermine our economic self-interest. And you look at Trump and Vance. Trump, mother's side of the family, Scottish, old Scottish fisherman, not deeply enmeshed in the English elite. The J.D. Vance, Appalachian. It's my favorite ancestral designation in the U.S. Census. They go by and they say, "Okay, what's your ancestry?" And these people get really upset. And they'll be like, "What are you talking about? I'm American." They're like, "No, I mean, are you English? Are you French?" I'm American. And they'll threaten to shoot the census taker before he can get out of there. So that's the J.D. Vance tradition with hillbilly elegy. So both of them come from a skeptical view. They're not Anglophobes, but they're definitely not Anglophiles, and they lean more in that direction, as does the populist influence in America, which often is heavily German and Irish and Scotch-Irish in the East Tennessee Hills. So like the Appalachia where he came from, historically, Scotch-Irish, who often their main adversaries was England, was the old royal family. So it comes from those political traditions that sort of pass on ancestrally through narratives and stories and political belief structures. So that kind of makes sense in that regard. As to this you're right, America policy, the American system, designed in part by Alexander Hamilton, was predicated in part on what Britain initially did, which was that basically you follow, Kevin Phillips details this in Industrial Policy and other books, Politics of Rich and Poor, Bad Money, The Boiling Point, great, the best political analyst in American history and comes from a very populist informed direction, is Kevin Phillips, passed away a few years ago. He famously said, going to your conservative point, he said, "I don't recognize much conservatism in these so-called conservatives." He goes, the American Republicans don't want to conserve anything. They don't want to conserve communities. They don't want to conserve a way of life. They don't want to conserve a constitutional liberty. They just want, they believe in chaotic free markets that would destroy, that are meant to enrich and empower them at the expense of ordinary people, because they're really not free markets. It's crony capitalism at heart, corporatism through the state. And that's influences their economic policies. So Vance is even more pro-tariff than Trump is, if that's possible. So like there were some doubts about, is Trump serious about what he's going to do trade-wise with China? I'll get to China in a second, or with the EU. He's absolutely serious. He's gonna run circles around the EU in this. The EU is trying to get us further embedded in the Ukrainian war. At the same time, they want unfair, what Trump sees as very unfair trade policies with the U.S. Both ain't happening for sure. So, I mean, good luck trying to. Can you imagine Vander Crazy trying to negotiate with Trump? I mean, that's like a dwarf tossing contest. It should be illegal in terms of the disparities of influence and power. So, and negotiating skill and tactics. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, yeah, it is what it is. So, I would recommend that there was a decent interview with Robert Leitzinger did, the U.S. Trade Representative with Tucker Carlson. Leitzinger and Peter Navarro are the two biggest intellectual influences on Trump's trade policy. Vance is deeply aligned with them. He's even more Trump than Trump on that. And the goal is simple: leverage the access to the richest consumer market in the world, which is the United States, leverage it to re-onshore American manufacturing. But that's only the first goal. The second goal is to replace the world, China included, in global manufacturing markets. And that's where, I mean, I think China figured it out. It wasn't just about the changing our trade relationship with China. It was about changing our trade relationship with the world, in part to replace Chinese manufactured goods with U.S. manufactured goods. Now there's some part of that that's a national security objective with with some groups and influences, and this reflects sort of broader Trump policy toward China, particularly. So China will be his focal point on trade. How it was sold to the Americans at the time we authorized China to enter the World Trade Organization was similar to how they sold NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in the early 1990s. Trump was opposed to it all the way back. People, think maybe Trump originated a lot of these populist themes. You can find it in Pat Buchanan's 1992 presidential campaign. You can find it in Ross Perot's independent campaign for the presidency in 1992. Two principles Ross Perot ran on. One was independence in trade, and the other was no blood for oil. People forget that part. Perot was a very anti-war tradition. The media just only talked about his budget policies and his unique personality. They didn't want to talk about his two actual most popular policies, which was changing trade policies and rejecting globalism fundamentally. But the way it pitched was, if we bring China into the World Trade Organization and we leverage, and this was part of what Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia was about. Also recommend people watch Vance's speech yesterday this weekend to the U.S. Naval Academy, because he expanded on and further intellectualized the Trump policies, which is really going to become Vance policies. And I think the probability he's the president is very, very high. 75, 80% is, if you're out there in the betting market, what I put it on if you want to wait 4 years to cash in. They see China in very different than how it was sold to us Americans at the time of the World Trade Organization. What Bill Clinton and George W. Bush pitched was that by leveraging American economic influence and access to the American consumer markets, it would lead to a flourishing of freedom and liberty in China, so much so that they couldn't wait to buy American goods, and it would be a net good for everybody, net benefit for everybody. It's like the Mearsheimer-Sachs difference. Sachs believes trade benefits everybody. Mearsheimer says everything's kind of a trade-off, at least in terms of power, if not economics. The Trump is more of the Mearsheimer school in that regard. In fact, you can find in some of Vance's speech, not Trump's speech, but Vance's speech at the Naval Academy, you'll find Mearsheimer elements, particularly as he's indirectly referencing China. He even uses the great powers language and all that kind of jazz. So you can see Mearsheimer's having some influence on Vance's perceptions of how foreign policy should be used. But the pitch was there'll be peace and freedom in China. China will become very prosperous, and it'll become like the American system. The Chinese workers will become so wealthy under the Chinese system that they'll now want to buy American goods, and will maintain a technological and skill edge in certain products, and that will make us all richer and all better off. Go forward about a quarter century. What has happened? None of the political reform that was predicted has ever happened. That has not happened within China. Chinese Communist Party arguably is more powerful today than it was 25 years ago when all this started. On the flip side, economically, there's been no explosion in the Chinese consumer market. Chinese still prefer to save and invest rather than spend, despite efforts within the Chinese economy to try to boost its domestic production, consumption. It hasn't been able to do so. And there's been no interest in China. China believed in the American system times 10 economically. They have never opened up their markets in that way because they see that as undermining Chinese security. which has usually been the priority, particularly under Xi, of the Chinese Communist Party. Domestic security, number one. Economic prosperity, number two. But not the other way around. So whereas what's happened in the U.S., we have seen our entire communities hollowed out overnight. And more economists have come to terms that all their promises and preaching, both as to NAFTA and to China and WTO, but we're wrong. It didn't lead to a boom in American wages. It led to basically a Great Depression. What's called America's heartland, quite literally, kind of like the Midlands in Britain, is now called the Rust Belt for a reason. It's because that's how much damage has been done to America's working class. In fact, you could argue that economic globalism writ large was to find all the places where labor had succeeded in getting a higher share of productivity and taking it away from them by first exporting jobs overseas and then importing immigrants into those countries to do all the rest of the jobs. So that your ordinary American working class person, like when Trump says "Make America Great Again," some people confused, thought it was some sort of like fascistic thing No, it was very simple. It was how America's working class remembers the 1950s collectively, or how Trump does, which was that a working class person could start a family, fund a family, support a family. The spouse wouldn't have to work. They would have accessible homes, accessible healthcare, accessible education, and they could live what was colloquially called the American dream. They could be wealthier and better off than their prior parents. They could have economic security. They could have pride in their work. Vance talks about this. Tucker Carlson often talks about this, that there's something about manufacturing that provides a psychological boom to the working class, not just a creative entrepreneurial boom in terms of innovation. The degree to which you have manufacturing presence is directly proportionate to the amount of innovation you create in new ideas, new projects, new technologies, and the rest. There's some connection there that's almost inescapable. Russia's almost rediscovering aspects of it when they were forced by European sanctions to more fully, thoroughly, completely reindustrialize, enriching and empowering them, arguably, much more so than they were before the sanctions ever existed. So Putin's not worried about that, amongst other reasons why he's not worried about foreign sanctions. As he's built up an economy largely immune from it, he did that after the first wave in Crimea sanctions. So to them, everything that was promised about China was a lie, that America's working class have paid the price for all of it. And they have no more interest in America's working class continuing to pay that price. Their perception of China internally, in terms of what they think their negotiating leverage is vis-a-vis China, this is where you get very divergent perspectives. You have some people that think China's economy is really growing, its society is very stable, its politics is really good, so forth. That is not the majority view within Trump world. Now, it depends on which aspect. You have some that I would even call more on the neocon, kinetic conflict side, that will actually, in my view, exaggerate China's potency and power for the purposes of saying they're a threat, like to the super chat question earlier. The Vance and his world aren't as fully convinced of that. So you have multiple, in terms of U.S. political perceptions of China, you have multiple strains influencing it. That's the broad overview in terms of the economic relationship. In terms of internally, the first opposition to China came because the Chinese Communist Party winning in China. So you had the anti-communist Cold War mindset and mentality, but that then shifted to the Soviet Union with Nixon's détente with China in the early 1970s. The next wave of opposition to China in the U.S., or hostility to China in the U.S., came from religious groups. Started out with evangelicals and Catholics, and this goes all the way back 1860s, various treaties between China and other countries about how Catholics and missionaries would be treated within their country during the Opium Wars. Britain tried to force it on China over and over again. You will take the opium. You will use the opium. That I can see where China may have certain perspectives on fentanyl based on that history that they still remember very well to this day, particularly their leadership cast. But that led to further things. John Birch Society was founded after John Birch, a missionary to China that they believe the Chinese Communist Party was behind murdering. So you had evangelical opposition to China. The next level of opposition to China came from various other religious dissident groups. This includes primarily more aligned with the left and celebrities, Tibet. So support for Tibet led to a group of people that are to this day opposed to China. Senator Moynihan's daughter. I was at a dinner, and all she would do is talk my ear off about how bad China was because of Tibet. She would just go on. Like, okay, I get it. But that's a very intense sort of cause celeb within certain communities. And then you have the Falun Gong, a religious group that felt persecuted by China, including things like forced organ donations and things like that. And they helped found publications like the Epoch Times. So China Uncensored, for example, that if you want to see a China skeptical perspective on YouTube or elsewhere, China, either the Epoch Times or China Uncensored would be good illustrations and examples of that. You don't have to agree with everything. It just gives you what that perspective is. But that comes, they were founded by the Falun Gong, members of the Falun Gong. The next wave of opposition to China was something I personally experienced as a young intern at the AFL-CIO, America's leading labor union. And that was, I worked with Harry Wu, the longtime Chinese labor activist. And so my initial or early experience with China was China's that labor movement in the United States strongly opposed how China was treating its workers, and as a potential threat to America's laboring classes and its labor unions, especially, particularly in the manufacturing industry, where they ended up right, and the Jeffrey Sachs and others of the world ended up wrong about what would happen with China to America's working class. Then you have two other aspects that have been added over the last decade or so. One is I would call sort of the neoliberal economic globalist side, who believes China should be a subordinate factory worker, right? Like this is where you might find George Soros being critical of Xi. And it's like, oh, that seems a little bit odd. I mean, even though because China was supposed to be the economic boost, the economic foundation, you could argue, of economic globalist. You're going to be our factory worker. But from their perspective, it meant subordinate factory worker. And they think Xi sticks his head up a little too much and is a little too nationalistic. And so there you'll see some neoliberal opposition to within the global economics, even to China. It's not universal by any means. Jeffrey Sachs, strong advocate for China, and some others. So you'll see a diverse range of opinions within that scale. On the neocon space, they want kinetic conflict. They want to prove. I mean, like people wonder, why is the deep state the deep state? No war, no money. No war, no power. So they got to find it. I mean, well, what are you going to do? And Trump sort of accidentally let this out a couple of weeks ago, where he's like, oh no, he was asking at the Saudi speech when he riffed. He's like, it's amazing to make all these weapons. You never get to use them. What's the point? He just briefly mentioned. Yeah, exactly. That's the issue, right? It was like, China is using the India-Pakistan conflict to see how well their drones work in part of the conflict. It's a test ground. All the military-industrial complex of the whole world has been using Ukraine as, hey, see how good our weapons, these tanks work, these drones work. I mean, it's a sick mindset, but this is how these people work. They make money building these war instruments that only have any purpose if there is a war. No war, no machines. No war, no money. No war, no power. So they're in the war business. So that's the Pompeo side. Then you have, I would call, Leitzinger represents this perspective. Peter Navarro, to a certain degree, represents this perspective. And this influence is part of Vance. And you see it represented sort of Mearsheimer's perspective. And that goes to the earlier Super Chat question. Sees China as a power threat, as a power competitor in Asia. And for them, now, like Trump's general perspective is he doesn't really care who runs Asia. Doesn't care. He made that kind of clear. The Americas will be fine. I think what you were pointing out earlier about great powers with regional controls is Trump's strong orientation. Trump loves President McKinley. So people should go back and study. Kevin Phillips did a great biography of President McKinley. That will give you a sense of what's informing Trump's framing and filtering and perspective of the world. Vance, a little bit more different. Vance is influenced to a degree by Mearsheimer. And so he does see a bit of this global power challenge. And what has sort of arisen in this context, two things. Rise of China's military spending, how there are various activities in the South China Seas, interpretation of the Belt and Road Initiative, because of two things. They recognize the Belt and Road Initiative not only had a potential economic gain, but it had a potential, from China's perspective, security. From the certain American perspectives, military incursions, military empowerment, that these ports had a military capacity. So the things that might look as civilian up front under domestic Chinese law, it's supposed to be able to serve military purposes as well, that they see it as a potential military expansionistic threat. I'm still a little bit more aligned with McGregor, who sees what China is doing is mostly paranoia of invasion because of what happened in the mid-19th century with the two opium wars and the rest, and that their military really isn't being designed for expansionistic purposes. But there are others that have a very different view. They think that China is openly planning and intending to run the world in their mindset. And they look at books like Unconventional Warfare, the Chinese government wrote in the late 1990s, or high-ranking military security people did. And they look at the sabotage. That's the other issue where China has lost a lot of allies in the United States, is various forms of sabotage. This includes intellectual. Basically, you'll hear this story again and again, which is somebody goes and invests in China, Within a couple of years, China steals all their products, all their intellectual property, and the rest, kicks them out, steals all their money. And you get variations of this. People will find a knockoff product that they make. All of a sudden, China's making the same thing. It's being advertised or marketed on TikTok. They look at Chinese propaganda through TikTok, showing racial divisiveness and cultural divisiveness and those kind of things. And so they think that what sits behind that is not China trying to protect itself, but they think China trying to influence the American public for China to dominate the world. And this reflects longer standing concerns of seeing communism as indistinguishable from imperialism. I have some doubts about that, but that's some of the perspective that is informing them. Now, I have doubts about where China is economically. Now, it's almost impossible to get honest data. You have the China Beige Book, which is good. That's an attempt to recreate the Beige Book for China. China has no interest in giving out negative data about itself. And it's still the Chinese. It reminds me the most of. You guys will understand this. It was like trying to figure out what the heck was happening in the Soviet Union in the 80s. You know what I mean? It was like you either got all Soviet propaganda or all anti-Soviet propaganda. Figuring out what the heck fire was going on. You had somebody on the ground somewhere, someplace to give you intel. That's what China's like for me. Now, if you want to see a more China skeptical perspective of a couple of guys who lived in China but are very independent, they're not connected to any state actors. The China Show on YouTube is very good for that. It's actually very funny. They have a lot of funny stuff mixed in. But if you want to see that, they live for about a decade plus in China, have friends and family still in China. And they have a China skeptical perspective of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to and what's happening within China. From their perspective, and this is partially represented in aspects of the Trump administration, and it's going to moderate how he handles aspects of China. If you think China's weak, not like this is where some of the pro-China advocates, I think, are actually undermining China's interest by trying to make China look very strong, because that's going to trigger concerns in certain aspects from the great powers analysis of Mearsheimer that, China's got to be taken down a notch because they're about to be so powerful, because they're about to be so. If they're really not, and they're weaker, what happens if you push a trade conflict and the only way the Chinese Communist Party feels it can maintain power is to go to Taiwan? Or to have war, to get out of internal political trouble because their economy is actually internally weak, that tariffs could push over the edge. And I think how you analyze those underlying dynamics is going to actually influence policy. And figuring out the truth is difficult. I mean, there's evidence that China's economy is weak. There's always been a big question. Could you use the American system, using trade policy and industrial policy, to build up a big manufacturing base without also building up a domestic consumer base, which has always happened before in Britain, the U.S., and elsewhere in the prior examples? And can you do so with a command and control economy? Because in theory, entrepreneurialism will unleash the sort of economic freedom, but that is limited when you have a fundamentally command and control polity. And how are those two going to work together? It's always been an open question. One interpretation works just fine. Another interpretation is there's fractures in the very foundation. And so that, you see factories on fire because people have not been paid wages, so they protest by it. Happened a week ago where a guy became a popular meme character because he went in and set his factory on fire in China. People who have no political expression outlet, who do things like, they're having to put up various pillars to block road access to schools because these people kind of lose their mind of everything that's happening and drive through and kill kids as a public protest expression. When you don't have an easy means of expressing protest or thinking you can change the power structure, what do you do when things like your life savings disappear because the real estate economy has imploded as it has in China because they had to shift after the global financial crisis to more employment through a domestic construction and infrastructure industry, but you can only build so many bridges and so many buildings. And what happens when people, China has the biggest real estate bubble, according to some data, in the history of the world. And there's at least some independent verification of that. And big real estate developers like Evergrande having the biggest bankruptcy in the history of the world. So what you think is really happening internally in China is going to shape U.S. policy towards China, influenced by these various strains of people who are skeptical of China for varying reasons, some economic, some cultural, some religious, some political, some geopolitical. I don't know fully the answer. Is the long and short of it. Expect Trump to try to balance it out. He wants to leverage U.S. economic consumer market access to reindustrialize and re-onshore American industry. He will highly prioritize those industries that are high-value jobs that have national security implications. This includes steel. This includes, for him, autos are a big deal. United Auto Workers is critical to support places like Michigan. which was a critical swing state. That's why when he announced his tariff policy, number one target was China, number one audience, United Auto Workers. He is absolutely committed to this. What he is mostly worried about is not so much China's reaction, regardless of what's happening internally within China. His concern is how do the global equity, the globalists who have incredible not only institutional influence in the think tanks, the academies, the House, the Senate, just like the deep state does, but they have incredible power on Wall Street, incredible power in the financial and real estate markets. We've financialized our entire Western economies, I think, to great detriment. You can read Kevin Phillips' book, Bad Money, for how this would lead to bad outcomes for long-term prosperity for America's working class and the working classes of the West. So that's going to be his priority, is figuring out how much can he leverage tariffs to get this outcome without economic globalists sinking the market deliberately, shorting the market deliberately. Here, I don't fully agree with all of his points, but I think he's on to a good kernel of truth, which is Tom Longo, who you guys have had on. What's it? That's like Guns and whatever. He's got a great title for his shows, like Guns and Gold and other popular stuff. He's always smoking cigars when he's talking, so I like Tom. But he was like Trump's focus also in part is Europe. It's divorcing from Europe. It's separating from Europe. It's trying to reduce the influence of the euro dollar, which is the dollar issued by global banks outside the United States that Alex was mentioning earlier, that has been the financial foundation of this entire globalist experiment, of which the EU is a critical constituent component. If Trump could have the EU collapse, it would be fantastic for Trump's long-term view of restoring a national, independent, economic-driven world rather than globalists. I don't know how is Germany going to handle this? I mean, Germany's already practically deindustrializing. They can't handle a major tariff policy from the United States, to my knowledge. They keep digging one hole, digging another hole, digging another hole. Apparently, Metz's magical straw doesn't work for IQ. Doesn't boost that part of it. However many Zelensky train trips you want to take. So that's Trump's general perspective on China. And Vance is a little bit more on the geopolitical strategic side. Sees China as more of a national security risk, not to the degree like Pompeo does. If you want to see Vance's view, about a year and a half ago, he did a speech on what he meant by his China policy. And his focus, like Trump's, was economic and national interest, not war. Had no interest in getting into a war with China whatsoever. That is still the strong, overwhelming influence on the Trump administration, is an opposition to wars that usually lead to disaster and debacle. But there is a skepticism of China. Trump's perspective is simple. China negotiated well for themselves. It's time to negotiate for America. That's Trump's view. He wants to reduce the amount of Chinese competition with the United States by using tariff policy to equalize it. That's it. For Vance, it's an additional component of whether or not they're a security threat. Are they going to continue to do things like put things in solar panels that show up in the United States that you later find out could do things like maybe turn off the power grid of the United States? Things like he has more saboteur concerns about China. So however you think of that or assess that, that's his perspective. Now, and you have Sachs' perspective. He sees China as a very peace-oriented, very Confucius influenced. Now, of course, from my own perspective, I didn't remember that Sun Tzu's book was called Art of Peace. It was called Art of War. But those are the different perspectives, and they're going to continue to influence the administration.
Right, very, very, very interesting. Now, there are a few things to say. Firstly, I just wanted to say something about the American system and how it's interconnected in the 19th century with US foreign policy. At that time, the American economic system was a economic system that was anchored on peace. It absolutely believed that the United States should focus on peace. I think it was Calvin Coolidge who said America's business is business, and that was very much the dominant policy in the United States in the late 19th century, right up until the moment when the Cuban War began. And that Cuban War was itself something, it must be said when it happened, of an anomaly. People talk a lot about Theodore Roosevelt and what he was up to, and all the policies that he followed. But in fact, he didn't deviate as president very much from the American mainstream foreign and economic policies up to that time. You start to see the change with Woodrow Wilson, who has a different view of the kind of policies that the United States should be following. So just to make that point, it was protectionism, industrial policy within the United States infrastructure policy within the United States, the operation of markets as not just, or rather I should say financial markets, not as, the dominant part of the economy, but as an important part of an economy that is larger than themselves. All of those things taken together were, as I said, very much based on the assumption that the United States would remain peaceful, that its military would not be overextended, and certainly not involved around the world, or any of those sort of things. And that was a popular policy, exactly as you were saying, in the United States. In fact, it wouldn't be correct to say it was the popular policy in the United States. It was the policy that everybody took for granted. It was, the underlying default assumption that people who worked in the factories, in the shipyards, in the fields of the United States, the agricultural system and the money exchanges in New York, in the political system. I mean, that was their default assumption about what the foreign policy of the United States should be in that era of the American system and of protectionism. So, and you could argue, and I would argue, by the way, that what changed the direction was the skill of certain European politicians, particularly British ones, in involving the United States in European affairs, and specifically in British affairs. And that is a huge story, which maybe we should one day do a dedicated program to. It's incredibly interesting. And it happened at multiple different levels, and we've touched on it previously in previous programs. Now, let's turn to China, because I have not been very involved in Chinese affairs recently. I should say, just to say something, I've always been very interested in Chinese history and Chinese culture and Chinese painting and that kind of thing. But curiously enough, it's always been Chinese history, painting, literature, all of that pre the modern era. It's the old China, which of course doesn't, it's a different China today. But I've started to take a much bigger interest in China recently. And I'm going to say what my own general sense is. Of course, this is an enormous country. It's huge. There are many different people with very different political views there. And there are parts of the economy that function extremely well, and others, no doubt, which has many, many problems. And so what I'm going to say now is just an impression of perspectives in China. And I'm not going to say that as everybody holds to these perspectives, but I think this is probably the dominant view amongst Chinese policymakers. And by that, I also mean the very large number of people who are involved in managing the economy at many, many different levels, which is that they're toughly pragmatic and extremely realistic. And they understand very well that China has come very far, very, very fast. And they also understand that China itself now needs to change and evolve and develop in all kinds of ways. They don't want to see a massive breakdown in the political system, because China, before the Communist Party of China, the CPC, gained power in the 1940s, had been through a whole century of massive political instability. And this is something which Chinese people at every level are very, very conscious of, and absolutely do not want to return to that. So they want to carry out that change, probably within the framework of the existing system. But they do understand that change is needed, and not just needed, but at many levels is actually wanted. They want to see China evolve, maybe not fully in the directions, in the kind of social patterns that people in the West might want to see it change. But we're talking about China. We're not talking about, the West. So they do understand all of that. And they also understand that because of this enormous growth that China has achieved, it's now pressing against the United States in all sorts of ways. And I think what they want to do is that they want to manage that change. They want a dialogue with the Americans. They want dialogue with the Americans at many, many different levels. Now, what I've heard from people in Russia and have read from people in Russia is that negotiating with the Chinese is incredibly difficult. They are enormously, tough negotiators. They will negotiate over every single point. They will take advantage whenever they can, because partly I suspect that also is a reaction to the period of Chinese weakness, which is the one that we overlook. So it's, they're almost over aggressive in the way that they negotiate. But if you are well prepared, if you negotiate toughly, they will respect you. And it's possible to move forward on that basis. So I think that a tough administration in Washington is not something they're afraid of. What they are very, very much more afraid of is an irrational administration in Washington that gets panicked about China and starts doing crazy things, very much in the way that Joe Biden and his people were doing. My sense was when Donald Trump became president, there was a sigh of relief. They were actually happy to see the back of Biden, Harris, and all of those people. They said, look, Trump may not like us very much, but we remembered him from his first term. If we negotiate toughly with him at a personal level, we got on with him, we can find a way forward. So I think that is the dominant mood in China today. Now, the events of March and April, when we saw this cumulative effect of sanctions going up, tariffs going up on each side. Now, that has probably somewhat dented that. And I think there is some alarm, and there is some alarm about some of the things that people, especially Stefan Miran, has been saying. But I think that if you got together a strong negotiating team, if you went through all of these issues with the Chinese one by one in a detailed way, just as they do when they conduct negotiations, then I think you could actually find that you could agree a way forward towards that economic divorce, which I think is ultimately what both the United States and China at the present time, each in their own very different ways, want. If you give to the Chinese the sense that what you're trying to do is to put a ceiling on their economic development, that is what they will push back against. And I think there is that fear in China that the United States doesn't want China to develop and become a prosperous country and an advanced country. But if you actually, as I said, seek an economic divorce, avoid military conflict, the preponderant feeling in China is let's go with that. It actually, if anything, works to our benefit at this time. That this period of chimerica, as we used to call it in Europe, when the United States and China seem to be very tightly integrated, something that worked very strongly to China's advantage, perhaps not so much to America's advantage as we've seen, that period is over and it doesn't really work for China itself anymore. So that I think is the sense I get from talking to people in China and from listening and what they have to say and from reading what they have to say. And yes, there are problems with statistics. And yes, there have been many, many problems at many, many levels. And many people in China understand that very well. And as I said, they do want to sort it out. But they don't want revolutions or chaos or any of those things because they've been there before. And they've seen what happened in the Soviet Union and in Russia. And they say, for God's sake, we don't want that over here. That's my overall sense of the whole thing.
Speaking of great negotiators, and our last topic for today, the Iran.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
misperception of Trump's Israel
Yeah.
approach in the populist community writ large. So you've got sort of domestic U.S. politics concerning Israel, the different groups that influence it in the court of public opinion. The only sort of committed anti-Israeli audience comes from sort of the old progressive left. Many of whom are also Jewish. And this goes all the way back to Jewish left criticism of Zionism in Israel as a concept and as a construct. And Lenin was very anti the construct. There are others that were. That goes all the way back to that debate. But but that's a relatively small. It's a very loud group, but it's not a very big portion of the American electorate. The second group that's kind of anti-Israel in American politics to a degree are Muslim voters, for religious-based reasons primarily, but also for regional, because of where they come from. A lot of them from Lebanon, other places that have a reason for hostility, or in there some Palestinian population, of course, some Somali population. In terms of where our Muslims in America come from. But they too are pretty small, and outside of like Minnesota, don't have disparate influence, and including some of the biggest Muslim states are also some of the biggest Jewish states, like New York and New Jersey, for example. So politically, they kind of counterbalance each other out. And so that's sort of on the left, loosely aligned, though Muslim voters massively shifted in 2024 in places like Dearborn, where they probably have the most potential impact over Biden's Israel policy. So and Trump made major inroads there. And I think to a certain degree, Trump personally is probably most at ease and most comfortable in an Arab bazaar as any place. I mean, you think of great negotiators and you think of Arab bazaars, right? You go and negotiate right there. So you could see when he was in Saudi Arabia, he's very much at home in that world, very much at ease with that world. They even have similar cultural styles. They like fancy things, like gold this, like that. Same mindset, much more so than other parts of the world where Trump feels truly at ease and at home. But politically, he's been trying to create an alignment with the Arab royals because he sees them as a solution, if you will, to Islamic fundamentalism and to aspects of Israeli excess. So, but that's one on but the true anti-Israeli constituent. Like sometimes I see people in the global media misinterpret the loudness of the progressive left here with being a real movement in the United States against Israel. That doesn't really exist. It's very small. It's 2-3% of the population. They're real loud on social media. They're real loud in protest. They go and do crazy things like murder people outside the Israeli embassy. But they're a tiny, tiny, tiny group. On the right, the main groups that support Israel politically, and this is in terms of voting constituencies, is evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews. But it's not all evangelicals. It's church-going evangelicals of a particular kind of type. So you have like church-going evangelicals and cultural evangelicals. So cultural evangelicals are people that what identify as evangelical Christian, is born again in the lingo and language that I grew up with in Tennessee. But they don't go to church very often. And they're actually skeptical of the church as an institution. Like this confused a whole bunch of pollsters and political consultants in 2016. They're like, how could Trump get evangelical votes? Trump's this, loudmouth, brash New Yorker. How is he going to win a bunch of? It's because their image of an evangelical was a good church lady evangelical who goes to church every time and has forever. But half of your evangelical population in America does not regularly attend church. They're people I grew up with in East Tennessee who think the church failed them as an institution. Like a lot of working class Catholics believe today. So regardless of the new pope, we'll see how that all works out. And how that translates. But I did love all the memes. I love Trump putting the Pope hat on. I thought that was great. A few whiners that complained. No working class Catholic I knew that likes Trump complained. I thought it was fun. The Orthodox Jews, about 2-3% at most. I mean, depending, they're mostly concentrated in New York City, so they don't have a lot of real political zeitgeist in terms of voting power. Now they're disproportionately represented in certain conservative media. Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin, others that are aligned in that cause. But people shouldn't confuse that with actual voting power. The real voting power in favor of Israel or on the Israeli issue writ large comes from evangelical Christians who are co-religionists, and particularly Protestants. So like some people were surprised that like Tucker Carlson is more skeptical of Israel. Well, Tucker's Catholic, and historically not been a lot of love between Catholics and Jews. There's a little more hostility historically there. the Inquisition, mass expulsion of Jews from Spain, things like that. To all my Catholic friends out there, so that's just reality. And there's been more conflict, particularly post-Israel, between Muslims and Jews. But for Protestants, much less so. Like, I grew up in an evangelical Protestant tradition, and we grew up, being taught Jews are God's chosen people, that Israel represents God's chosen people. So there wasn't hostility or animosity there at all. In great credit politically of Israel, they'd made two tactical decisions that advanced their interest in the U.S. very, very well. First was choosing the U.S. over the USSR during the Cold War. So that gave them a big boost in the U.S. But even in the post-Cold War era, the question was how much will Israel still have allies in the United States? Well, Israel treated evangelicals very well because evangelicals see Israel as their, as both of them, obviously, and some aspects of Islam as their ancestral homeland, though Islam is more Mecca and Medina than it is Israel. And you had free access. So if you were an evangelical Christian, you could tour anywhere you wanted in Israel. You were treated very well in those tours. You could visit the Holy Land. That, to be frank, wasn't often true when there was Islamic control of the region. So because of that, there is a deep alignment of most, but it's more the church-going evangelical than the non-church-going evangelical. So otherwise, the populist inclination is to side with Israel over Hamas, because for them, for two reasons. One is sort of vestigial of the Cold War and reflective of sort of a co-religionist mindset amongst the Protestants, especially in the United States, they see Jews as co-religionists, not oppositional religious. And then on the other side was who decided to align with the Palestinian cause. And just as the anti-war cause was done bad damage in the United States by its alignment with the hard left, so the Palestinian cause was done bad damage in the United States by its alignment with the hard left. First with the Soviet Union and communist advocacy that, remade Yasser Arafat into a nice tie-wearing student into the Che Guevara-looking gorilla that he wore those out protester, revolutionary, that he would later become synonymous with. But just in general with the hard left. I mean, even adopting the language and rhetoric, colonizer, imperialist. If you want to antagonize conservatives and lose their support, start using language that sounds like a hard left woke university professor. And unfortunately, a lot of the people aligned with the Palestinian cause adopted that language and rhetoric, and all that did is push away, your Mike Cernoviches of the world, right? You're sort of normie populist, if you could call them that. That being said, what has been misunderstood by the Israeli supporters in the United States is there are limits to that support, and they're discovering it in live time. And Netanyahu is going to keep discovering it vis-a-vis Trump. So within the populist constituency in America, Netanyahu has always been viewed skeptically. And the reason he's always been viewed skeptically is some of us, we will never forgive him or pardon him for him running around the United States preaching that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and we had to have a war in Iraq to make the world safe. Granted, Netanyahu was not the leader of Israel at that time. The Israeli government's official policy didn't fully confirm that. But it doesn't matter when it's Netanyahu who did it for the purposes of now. What that did is that sowed distrust with people in the populist camp of Netanyahu tactically. It's not because suddenly we're going to cheer for Hamas, but what it means is we're not going to reflexively do whatever it is Netanyahu has schemed up now. And then some of Netanyahu's early neocon advisors in the late 1990s came to be advisors in the U.S. who were preaching this whole General Wesley Clark talked about, libertarian Dave Smith talks about, that, is like, if you wanted to get the worst possible representative of Israel, have Douglas Murray be the guy who wrote a book called Neoconservatives, praising neoconservatism. And he's got a British accent, and he's an arrogant prick. He's all three. I'll give Rogan credit. Let's bring the arrogant British prick on to represent Israel. Or you get Ben Shapiro, who just has Israel first tattooed on his forehead. The populist mindset is sympathy towards Israel, more sympathy towards Israel than Hamas or Fatah, but limits on the degree to which the U.S. should get entangled in the latest Netanyahu scheme, which it always seems, go back to those late 90s. You read some of those publications, and they're some of the dumbest geopolitical analysis ever. It's like, you can be the most pro-Israel person in the world. Why do you think overturning and regime change throughout Mideast is going to lead to more peace? Why? Won't it lead to more Islamic terror? Maybe that will cause you more trouble in the end. Maybe. But they said somehow it would magically lead to an unearthing of, I don't know, the freedom of democracy or liberty or whatever. And all we've seen is disaster in Iraq, disaster in Syria, disaster in Libya, separate analogous disaster in Afghanistan. It's like we have no more interest in that. So interest in peace and protection and security for Israel, yes. But there are limits. The populist constituency that supports Israel is the critical tipping factor, that you remove them from the political equation, and Israel doesn't have majority support anymore. They're not going to have majority opposition ever, right? There's a part on the right. There's two parts on the right that don't like Israel. One is an honest, principled libertarian position, represented Dave Smith is kind of an independent libertarian, but Rand Paul, Ron Paul, Thomas Massey, their position is real simple. Israel's problems are Israel's problems. Let's not get involved. It's not pro-Israel. It's not anti-Israel. That's but that doesn't represent a big voting constituency. The populist constituency is what tips the factor to make sure the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world are aligned on Israeli policy. If you lose them, Israel loses its most critical and essential ally. But Netanyahu is such a tactical moron. There were two other things that hurt with Netanyahu. The big one was his support of the Iraq War, for which he's never apologized, and for all the other ideas of regime change that sounded idiotic and to which, to my knowledge, he's never fully recanted. And if you want the pro-Israeli perspective on this, a really good Substack writer is Elon Hulkower, Hulkower. Does great history, does great documents, and it'll give you a more Israeli sympathetic perspective, though balanced with geopolitical realism. The second problem in Netanyahu that led populist skepticism here, again, best represented by voices like Alex Jones, was his COVID policies. He was a huge lockdown guy, huge vaccine guy. That led populists to wonder how much of Israel is exactly an ally. People forgetting Israel is a very collectivist. It started as kind of a socialist experiment way back. That's what Chomsky loved, the original little Israeli camps and more of that ideology than its current political orientation. But the third is Trump will never forgive Netanyahu for what he did after 2020. So Netanyahu was the first major foreign leader to rush to endorse Joe Biden after the election and basically rain on Trump's parade of challenging the election. And this story didn't get much coverage, but after October 7th, not long after, Trump did an interview, I think with Newsweek, in which he suggested that October 7th was at least in part Netanyahu's fault, that it was his failure of adequate security that happened. That gives you a sense of the scale of skepticism Trump has towards Netanyahu. It's not a coincidence that Trump goes to the Middle East, and this time, unlike his first term, skips Israel. It's not a coincidence that J.D. Vance canceled his trip to Israel after they decided to escalate in Gaza. So what Trump would like is he would like Israel to be peaceful, prosperous, an ally, but stop entangling us in stupid wars throughout the entire Middle East. And I've been skeptical of Netanyahu's policy in Gaza because even if you thought you thought they were morally right to do it, say, you had a self-defense position, which is in part Robert Kennedy's other people's position. He thought extended self-defense, you could do so morally and politically and legally. Okay, let's say you even stipulate to that. Was it going to work? Was it going to end Palestinian opposition to Israel? What are you going to replace Hamas with? Well, let's say you take out Hamas. How has that worked? Hasn't every time you do any form of regime change, hasn't the regime changed to something more anti-Israel than what was before? Something more unstable than what was before? So that was my skepticism of how the Gaza strategy. Now, I don't like language like genocide because to me, use genocide when it describes mass extermination of an entire population. I want it to be limited to its historical legal definition. Maybe you can call it ethnic cleansing, you can call it, but I don't like it when China's accused of genocide of the Uyghurs. I don't like it when they accuse Russia of doing it in Ukraine. I don't like it when they accuse Israel of doing it in Gaza. When your population's growing greater than their population's growing greater than yours, it's not genocide. You can call it oppression, you can call it ethnic cleansing, you can call it a lot of other things, but I would like the language. Using that language just antagonizes potential allies. It doesn't add to your allies from just a political persuasion toolkit. But Trump is not going to let Netanyahu get the U.S. into more stupid conflicts in the Middle East or undermine his global policy. Again, Saudi Arabia, very important for oil, very important to lower energy input costs, very important to Trump's cost of living agenda, which is the number one reason he won. Likes Israel, supports Israel. Has a lot of fans in Israel. Miss Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, is a big supporter. But he will not be hijacked by that policy. He has skepticism towards Netanyahu. He will do everything possible he thinks nuclear proliferation is a great risk, period. And he doesn't just isolate that to North Korea or an Iran. He says it's a great risk, period. And he has believed this for a long time. So he'll do everything possible to get a nuclear deal of non-proliferation. Which, by the way, who does he need as the key ally to make that deal happen? Russia and Putin. Another reason why he's very unlikely to escalate conflict with Russia and Putin. That Russia is the intermediary of holding that nuclear material is probably critical to any deal getting done. But Tulsi Gabbard immediately rained on the parade when the deep state allies were trying to say, Netanyahu's been preaching this for 15 years. Iran's right about to have a nuclear weapon, right about to have a nuclear weapon, right about to have. He cries wolf every 6 seconds. And October 7th is not an excuse to wage war around the world and to cause the U.S. to get into huge problems. So that's, I think, accurately represents to the Trumpian perspective. I think Trump thinks he can get a deal done with Iran. I think Trump will get a deal done with Iran. I think it's in Iran's interest to get a deal done. I think it's in Trump's deal to get a deal done. I think ultimately it's even really in Israel's long-term interest to get a deal done. It's like, what is bombing going to do? I mean, are you going to stop them from developing nuclear material because you just go in and raid and bomb whatever? And how do you know it's not going to escalate into a more broader conflict? I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it's Netanyahu's tactical wisdom that I and other people within sort of the populist and geopolitical realist camp are skeptical of. It's not hostility to Israel. It's not favoritism. Trump can respect the Arab royalist world. He can respect the Iranian perspective. As Putin pointed out, once we took out Gaddafi, after Gaddafi got rid of nuclear weapons, we were going to create a permanent problem where nobody was going to want to give up nuclear weapons because we had proven if you give up nuclear weapons, if you don't develop nuclear weapons, we can take you out at a moment's notice. That Gaddafi example is maybe the most disastrous decision for nuclear non-proliferation that has happened in the last century. So I think he understands that. He doesn't respect like religious fundamentalists of that kind of extreme. He doesn't even really understand them. Like to him, it's like, okay, if I find some way to make Palestinian lives economically richer, that's Trump's mindset in general. Hey, if I make you richer, isn't that a good deal? We can have peace and everything work out. I make you richer. That he thinks that's how most people operate. He almost doesn't understand someone for whom that doesn't process. It's like, what? He's like, those are weird people. You just got to stay away from them, right? That's just the Trump mindset. So that's why he'll never be sympathetic with Hamas at all, even if he's sympathetic with the plight of the Palestinian people. But he doesn't see as a solution a two-state solution at this point. That's just what his perception is that it just wouldn't work. It's not going to happen. But what he's not going to do is let Israel drag America into another stupid Middle Eastern war. And if the pro-Israel side doesn't hem it in and Netanyahu doesn't curtail his excesses, they're going to find themselves without allies anywhere in the world. So that's where I think that is like. I think he will get an Iran deal done. I don't think we'll end up with a war with Iran. He didn't brag about not doing the war in Iran in his first term to turn around and do it in his second term. And it's not an accident that he's not been visiting Israel or in advance isn't visiting Israel. It's a recognition, and it isn't an accident. They shipped off Mike Waltz to the UN that Trump doesn't care about the UN at all. I mean, you couldn't ship somebody to a more useless place. When Trump really despises you, he sends you to the United Nations. Look at Nikki Haley. He's like, I got to reward the lieutenant governor, make him governor. So I'm going to send Nikki Haley to the UN because he doesn't care what happens at the UN. He's like, shove off. So I think that's where it's most likely to the political fallout. So I see overreaches on both sides that the pro-Israeli crowd thinks they have such institutional support after October 7th, they can do anything at any time that they want. And they're wrong about that. And there's some on the anti-Israeli side that see the protest and the rest, and they think that means there's a real popular movement in the country to be opposed to Israel. That doesn't exist in the United States in a meaningful manner. That dynamic is not likely to change. But what is likely to change is if Israel gets us involved in another dumb war, they will lose critical majority support in this country from the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, as they've already signaled.
Hello. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a very complete analysis. And I think you've described, actually, I mean, my sense is that your description of the American mood about this is absolutely spot on. I don't have any pushback on this at all. What I'm going to say is a few things here. Firstly, when you said that Trump finds it very difficult to compute that if you set out to make people rich and prosperous and all of that, he can't understand the fact that maybe they don't see things entirely in that way. That is a very, very American problem. And Donald Trump is perhaps the most American president that there has been in my lifetime. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, in a kind of a way, also. I mean, he was a different type of America, a darker side of America, maybe. But I mean, the thing about Trump is, I always say this, he reminds me very much of the Americans I remember coming to Europe in the 1960s. He's very much part of them. And he doesn't understand why people want to kill themselves and fight wars instead of getting to work and doing business with each other and trading and making themselves prosperous. As I say, it's a very American way of thinking. Now, I think that what the United States needs in the Middle East is a stable Middle East, a peaceful Middle East. I think that lots of people have come to that conclusion in the United States itself. You said at the very outset of the program that people like J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard have been and have served in the Middle East, and they're very disillusioned about the whole experience there. And probably, I'm guessing, they don't like the way in which they feel that they were manipulated into going there, both by the neocons in the United States and possibly to some extent, and in fact, to a great extent, by Netanyahu as well. My own sense, and I say this, I think we are closer to a potentially stable Middle East than many people understand. I think Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states clearly want it. I think most of the Arab states also want it. I think that within the Palestinian community, they also want a return to peaceful conditions and some of that prosperity that we were talking about, at the very least, provided they can have a degree of security and political rights that has never been provided to them. I think Israel, if it were to act in a measured and moderate way and work with other countries, I don't think anybody in the Middle East any longer is thinking about destroying Israel or eliminating. Well, I'm sure there are people in the Middle East who do think like that, but I don't think they represent the predominant currents in the Middle East. I don't think the Gulf states are interested in that. I don't think many of the Arab states are interested in all of that. We have come, in other words, a very, very long way from the kind of Middle East that we had in the 50s and 60s and 70s when Israel was not accepted. And there is a third party who stands outside this process. And this is another place where I think Donald Trump, if he works with them intelligently, could usefully use them. And that is the Russians. The Russians want a stable Middle East. They want peace in the Middle East. They have good relations with the Palestinians, excellent relations with the Palestinians. They have civil and sometimes friendly relations with Israel. Netanyahu and Putin exchanged very warm congratulatory messages with each other on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the victory in Europe. In fact, people didn't really notice. And of course, Russia now has a big and growing presence in Iran, which, if it's approached intelligently, could be a stabilizing factor. So I think the Iranians also are now very, very tired of this endless confrontation with the United States, which has been going on since 1979. I think they understand too that it's holding back Iran and it's creating massive instability there. And I suspect that there's also forces in Iran which do want to see change and development in Iran and the evolution of the political system and even maybe the change of the political system. And they want the political space in order to do that too. So I think that if all of the pieces are brought together, if you have an intelligent foreign policy, one which doesn't overcommit, which is, I think, the big mistake that the United States has made. If it doesn't overcommit, then actually a peace in the Middle East is within reach. And certainly a peace with Iran is within reach, and a peace with Iran in which the United States, and by the way, Israel, can be confident that Iran will not develop nuclear weapons, because the Russians will be there and they'll be able to police it. And as I said, there's people in Iran who really understand that that's basically a dead end anyway. So I think I think the pieces are there, and maybe with the changes that you've been talking about in the United States, with this more populist current that's growing in the United States, maybe that can happen. I would like to think so. I think it can happen anyway. That's my sense.
Exactly. It's always good to hope for the best. I see the lights coming on in the background, so I've kept you up late enough. It's been fantastic as always. The Duran.locals.com. I'm a subscribing member, and the rest, and always a privilege and a pleasure, gentlemen.
And Robert, where can people find you? The great Robert Barnes.
If you want all the law and politics analysis, vivabarneslaw.locals.com. A couple of the references from the show, the China show, you can find on YouTube. Elon Hulkower, Hulkower, you can find on Substack. And I'll have some betting picks up on the Polish election. Got to figure out the fraud aspect. Got to figure out how likely the EU comes in and sets it all aside anyway. Poland, little word of the wise, don't elect the president from the party that has as its prime minister a man who ran around saying Trump was a Russian agent. Probably not a good idea for U.S.-Polish relations if you want to have any over the next 3 years. Probably vote the other way. I might be betting that way too. We'll see when the odds are done. That's at sportspicks.locals.com. As always, a privilege and pleasure with to be here.
Thank you so much.
A privilege and pleasure for us to have you, Robert, if I may say. As always, a very, very interesting and educational program. And just to say, we didn't perhaps discuss, we didn't take out the whole program, thank goodness, on the judicial aspects, but I learned an awful lot from you about that today as well.
We'll have all of Robert's links in the description box down below, as well as a pinned comment, and we will answer all of the super chats. They will be online tomorrow in a dedicated video. So look out for that as well. Great Robert Barnes, thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.